The man grabbed Clara's arm before she'd even set her bag down. Gerald Pratt, biggest landowner in Harwick Crossing, widest mouth in 3 counties, yanked her sideways in front of the entire feed store, hard enough that she stumbled against the porch rail. "You think you're going to walk into Caleb Whitmore's ranch and do what?" "Exactly," he said, loud enough for everyone on the street to hear. "Fix what his dead wife couldn't? Fix what he can't." He let go only when she didn't flinch. "Go back where you came from, lady. That ranch is finished, and so is anyone fool enough to hitch themselves to it." Nobody moved. Nobody said a word. Clara straightened her coat, picked up her bag, and looked him dead in the eye. "Then I guess I'll go help the fool," she said. If you've ever watched someone walk toward a thing everyone told them to walk away from, stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this story travels. And subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. Because what Clara walked into that evening was worse than anyone in town knew. And what she built from it will stay with you long after it's over. The ride out to Black Juniper Ranch took 40 minutes on a good road. In November, with the ruts frozen into jagged ridges and a wind coming off the mountain that cut straight through wool, it took closer to an hour. Clara had borrowed a horse from the liveryman in Harwick Crossing, a sway-backed gray who wanted no part of the cold. And she rode with her head down and her scarf pulled up over her nose, watching the land change from the sparse grid of the town into something older and emptier. She had been told the ranch was failing. She hadn't been told it looked like this. The fence line appeared first, or what was left of it. 3 rails leaning at angles that suggested they'd given up trying to stay upright and were simply waiting for the next hard wind to finish the job. Beyond them, the main pasture was mostly mud and frost. A few brown patches of grass the cattle had already stripped bare weeks ago. The cattle themselves stood in a loose, miserable cluster near the barn, backs humped against the cold, not moving because they didn't have enough energy to bother. Clara slowed the gray and counted the animals. 11 head. The man in town, not Pratt, a different one, the farrier who'd spoken to her quietly while Pratt wasn't watching, had said Caleb Whitmore ran 30 head before his wife died. Before the bad summer. Before the money ran out. 11. She clicked the gray forward. The farmhouse sat back from the barn by about 60 yards, and the first thing she noticed was the smoke, or the lack of it. One thin thread curling from the chimney, pale as old paper, barely visible against the pewter sky. For a house with 2 small children and a temperature dropping toward the single digits, one thin thread of smoke was not enough. It was barely anything. She dismounted near the porch and tied the gray to the rail, which wobbled when she touched it and was going to need attention. And she stood there for a moment, just listening. Inside, a child was crying. Not the sharp, startled cry of a child who'd hurt themselves. The low, exhausted cry of a child who'd been at it for a while and didn't expect it to help. Clara walked up the steps and knocked. Nothing happened for long enough that she knocked again, harder. "We don't need anything." The voice came through the door, flat and tired, with nothing left in it to be polite. "I'm not selling anything," Clara said. "My name is Clara Voss. I met your farrier in town. He said you might have room for a hand through the winter. I can work for room and board." Silence. A hand. The door opened 6 inches, held by a hand that gripped the edge of it like a man deciding whether to shut it again immediately. The man behind it was younger than she'd expected. Early 30s maybe, though he was carrying it older. Dark circles, a jaw that hadn't seen a razor in a week, eyes that were looking at her without really seeing her yet, still stuck somewhere behind her. "We had a hand. He left in October." "I know. The farrier told me that too. The farrier talks a lot. He seemed worried about you." The door didn't move. Clara could hear the child still crying inside, and now a second voice, older, maybe 7 or 8, saying something in a low tone, trying to calm the younger one down. Caleb Whitmore heard it too. She watched his jaw tighten. "What do you know about ranch work?" he said. "Enough. I grew up on a homestead in eastern Wyoming. Spent 4 years working for a cattle operation outside Billings before I came east." Billings. He said it like he was checking something against a list in his head. "What operation?" Harlan Briggs. He ran about 200 head out of a place called the Triple B. I worked the winter crew 2 years running, then helped manage the house and supplies the last two. Something shifted in his face. Not warmth, nowhere close to warmth, but a small recalibration. Briggs is a real outfit. Yes. You get along with him? Well enough that he offered to write me a letter if I needed one. She reached into her coat pocket and held it out. He looked at the letter without taking it. Then he opened the door the rest of the way. The smell hit her first. Wood smoke, unwashed wool, something sweet that had turned, maybe milk gone bad. And underneath it all, the particular cold, damp smell of a house that was losing its fight against the temperature. The front room held a table, 2 chairs, a cast-iron stove that was the source of that thin smoke, and the children. The younger one was sitting on the floor near the stove, 4 years old at most, red-faced from crying. The older one, the boy who'd been trying to calm her, was standing beside her with one hand resting on her shoulder, looking at Clara with an expression that was half suspicion and half something else. Something that made Clara's chest ache a little, because she recognized it. It was the look of a child who'd been the most reliable person in the room for too long. "This is Thomas," Caleb said with a gesture toward the boy. "And that's Meg. She's been at it since supper." "What happened at supper?" Clara asked. "She dropped her bread, didn't want another piece. I don't know." He rubbed his face. "I don't always know." "She's cold," Thomas said quietly. He said it to Clara, not to his father, with the careful matter-of-fact tone of someone reporting a fact that had been ignored. "She keeps saying she's cold." Clara looked at the stove. She crossed to it and opened the loading door and looked in. 2 pieces of wood, both thin, neither of them properly set. The fire was limping along on spite and habit. "Where's your woodpile?" she said. "Out back," Caleb said. "Split or round?" "Some of both." She closed the stove door. "I'll need to bring some in, and I'll need to reload this with some of the rounds. Split wood burns fast. You want it to last tonight, you need the rounds in there to hold heat." She looked up at him. "Where do you keep your kindling?" He pointed to a bucket near the door that held maybe a dozen sticks. "I'll need to make more. Do you have a hatchet?" Caleb stared at her for a moment. Then, with the slow movement of a man who'd stopped expecting things to be handled, he walked to the corner and picked up a hatchet from the floor and held it out. Clara took it. She looked at Thomas. "Will you show me where the woodpile is?" The boy glanced at his father. Caleb gave one small nod, and Thomas crossed the room and picked his coat off a hook by the door. The woodpile was under a lean-to behind the house, and it was in bad shape. Not empty. There was wood there, maybe 2 cords, enough to last into January if it was managed carefully, but it was a mess. Rounds and splits piled without order, some of them wet from where the lean-to's roof had been leaking, ice forming in the gaps between logs. Clara crouched down and started sorting through the outer layer, finding the driest pieces, and Thomas stood beside her and watched. "You actually know how to do this stuff?" he said. Not rude, genuinely asking. "I do." "Pa says women don't usually know ranch things." "Some do," Clara said. "I had 2 brothers and no sisters. I learned what was useful." Thomas considered this. "Our ma knew things," he said. "She knew how to make the bread rise right even in winter. Pa can't get it to work." Clara kept sorting wood. "What was her name?" "Ruth." He said it carefully, the way you say a name you've been trying to keep safe. "She died in March, the fever." "I'm sorry. Pa doesn't talk about her." "That doesn't mean he's not thinking about her." Thomas looked down at the ground. "I know, he just gets real quiet." A pause. "He was quiet before too, but different. Now it's like he's quiet and also sort of not here." Clara stacked 3 dry rounds in her arms and stood. "That happens sometimes. When people are carrying something heavy, they go inside for a while." She looked down at him. "You've been carrying a lot too." The boy didn't answer. He picked up some kindling sticks and held them against his chest. "You're good with your sister," Clara said. "Somebody has to be." They carried the wood inside in 2 trips. Clara rebuilt the fire from the bottom, kindling first, properly arranged, then 2 rounds set at angles to each other so air could move between them. She opened the damper all the way and let it breathe. and within 10 minutes, the stove was putting out real heat for the first time that evening. Meg had stopped crying. She was sitting on the floor watching the process with wet eyes and the focused attention of a small child who has found something more interesting than her own misery. Caleb stood at the table and watched Clara work without a word. When she stood and stepped back from the stove, he finally said, "You're going to want a place to sleep. Whatever you have. There's a room off the back. It was the—" He stopped, started again. "It's just a storage room now. There's a cot in there. It's not much." "That's fine. I can't pay you until spring. If the cattle—" He stopped again. Something in his face closed down, like he'd been about to say something and had thought better of it. "I can't make promises about spring." "I'm not asking for promises," Clara said. "I'm asking for a cot and meals. We'll figure out the rest when it comes." He looked at her for a moment with the eyes of a man who was used to things being taken from him and wasn't sure what to do with something being offered. Then he gave one short nod. "All right," he said. She learned the shape of the problem over the next 3 days. She did it quietly, without making announcements, because she'd worked enough places to know that announcing you'd found problems was a fast way to make the person who owned those problems defensive. Instead, she walked. She looked. She asked Thomas questions and let Caleb answer only when he wanted to. The firewood situation was the most immediate. The lean-to roof was bad. 2 boards sprung from their nails, leaving a gap about 4 inches wide that let rain and snow soak a whole section of the pile. Clara borrowed a hammer and nails from the barn on the second morning and fixed the roof before Caleb came in for breakfast. He saw the fresh nails when he went out to check the cattle and said nothing about it at supper, but he put more food on her plate than she'd been given the 2 nights before. The food storage was the second thing. The root cellar under the house held their winter provisions: potatoes, dried beans, some cured pork, preserves in jars, and whoever had organized it last hadn't done it with any particular plan. The potatoes were in contact with the wall, where the moisture was making them rot from the outside in. 3 of the jars had bad seals. Clara reorganized the whole cellar in an afternoon, pulling everything away from the walls, sorting through the jars, moving the things that would go bad fastest to where they'd be used first. She found 4 jars that had already failed and threw them out. She found 2 she could reseal. She told Caleb what she'd done that evening, simply and without drama. "I reorganized the cellar. You had some jars going bad. I've marked the ones that need to be used in the next 2 weeks, so they don't get wasted." He looked up from his coffee. "How much did we lose?" 4 jars. The rest is fine. You've got more than I expected. If we're careful, it'll carry through March." He was quiet for a moment. "Ruth was the one who did the cellar." "The organization system was good," Clara said, which was only partly true, but true enough. "It just needed some maintenance." He didn't say anything else, but she noticed he went down to the cellar himself before he went to bed, and she heard him down there for a long time. But the second week was when it got complicated. She'd gone into Harwick Crossing to pick up a few supplies she needed: beeswax, some heavy canvas, coarse salt, and she'd made the mistake of going on a Saturday when the feed store was busy. 3 men were there when she came in, and one of them was Gerald Pratt. She'd heard about Pratt from Thomas, who described him as Pa's neighbor but not Pa's friend, and from the farrier, who described him as a man who knows the price of everything and the value of nothing. She recognized him before anyone introduced him, because he was the only man in the store speaking at a volume that assumed everyone wanted to hear him. "Heard Whitmore took on a hand," Pratt was saying to the man beside him, a heavy-set farmer who nodded along to everything Pratt said the way people did when they owed someone money. "A woman, of all things." "That's so?" the farmer said. "Some wanderer? Showed up in the cold asking for work." Pratt shook his head with the particular kind of disgust that's really a performance. "Man's so far gone, he's taking in strays." Clara set her list on the counter and didn't look over. "You're her, aren't you?" Pratt said. She looked then. He was already watching her. Had been watching her come through the door, she realized. "If you mean am I working at Black Juniper Ranch? Then yes." Working. He said the word like it was something stuck in his teeth. What exactly does that mean? What does a woman do on a cattle ranch in winter? "Currently, I'm fixing a leaking roof on the woodpile, reorganizing the food stores, and planning a windbreak for the cattle shelter." She kept her voice level. "What exactly do you do on your ranch in winter, Mr. Pratt?" Gerald Pratt. He said it the way men said names they believed carried weight. I run 400 head and employ 11 men. Then I imagine you're busy, Clara said. She turned back to the counter. Whitmore's ranch is finished, Pratt said, louder now, talking to the room again. Man can't keep staff, can't keep cattle, can't keep... He paused just long enough. Can't keep much of anything. Clara turned around. You're describing a man who lost his wife 8 months ago and has been trying to hold a ranch together alone with 2 children, she said. If that's your idea of failure, I'd like to know what you think success looks like. The room was quiet. Pratt looked at her with a smile that wasn't actually a smile. Success is knowing when something's done and walking away. That ranch is done. Anyone with sense can see it. Well, Clara said, I'll make sure to check again in spring. She paid for her supplies and left. Her hands were steady by the time she got to the horse. She didn't let them shake until she was outside the town limits, on the long cold road back to Black Juniper Ranch, alone with the gray horse and the frozen fields and the clean, necessary anger that she'd learned a long time ago not to let anyone else see. She told Caleb what Pratt had said that evening, not because she needed to, but because he would hear about it eventually, and she wanted to be the one to tell him. He was quiet for a long time after. He's probably right, Caleb said finally. Clara looked up from the boot she was mending. About what specifically? About the ranch. He was staring at the table. I've had it in my head that if I can just get through winter, spring will be better. But I don't know that it will. I've been saying that for 8 months. You've been doing it alone for 8 months. I had Thomas. Thomas is 8 years old. Caleb didn't answer. What would it take, Claire said carefully, to get the cattle through to spring in reasonable shape? He looked up, like the question surprised him, like no one had asked it as a practical matter in a while. Better shelter for the cattle, Chi, he said slowly, as if he was reading from something he'd stopped looking at. The barn is too drafty. We lose heat as fast as we can make it. Better feed situation. I've been rationing, but if we get a bad January, what I have won't be enough. He rubbed his jaw. And I need to fix the east fence before the ground freezes solid, or I'm going to lose cattle to drift in the first real storm. All right, Clara said. It's a lot of work. Yes. I can't do all of it. I know, Clara said. That's why you have help now. He looked at her across the table. The fire was going strong. She'd kept it that way all week. And the room was warm in a way it hadn't been when she arrived. Meg was asleep in her room. Thomas had gone to bed an hour ago. And Caleb Whitmore sat across from her with a list of problems in his head that he'd been carrying alone and looked at her like he didn't quite know what she was. You don't have to do this, he said. I know. You could find a better situation. Somewhere not... He gestured at the room, the house, the general difficulty of everything. Somewhere not like this. I expect I could, Clara agreed. So why? Because this is the situation that needs someone, she said simply. I've never been good at walking past that. He didn't push it further. He nodded once, the way he nodded when something was settled, and they sat in the warm room for another half hour, both working quietly while the wind pushed against the windows and the fire held. On Sunday morning, Clara started on the cattle windbreak. She'd looked at the barn layout and decided that rather than trying to fix the drafts in the barn itself, which would take lumber they didn't have and time she wasn't sure they could spare, the better play was to build a barrier on the northwest side, where the worst weather came from. 3 walls of stacked hay bales, shoulder high, with a canvas roof weighted down with boards. Cheap, fast, and enough to cut the wind to almost nothing for the animals on the worst nights. Caleb came out to find her measuring with a rope and stopped. What are you doing? He said. She explained. He stood there in the cold listening, his arms crossed, and she watched his face do the thing it did when he was deciding whether to argue with her. Hay bales are heavy, he said. I know. I'll need your help with the stacking. I mean the cost. I need that hay for feed. You'll lose more from cold than from feed shortage, she said. The animals are burning calories just trying to keep warm. Get them out of the wind and they'll eat less and hold weight better. He was quiet for a moment. You sure about that? I've seen it, 2 winters in Billings. He looked at the northwest corner of the barn. He looked at Clara. He uncrossed his arms. "I'll get the sledge," he said. They worked for 5 hours. Caleb on the heavy end of every bale, Clara directing placement and running the ropes for the canvas roof. Thomas came out after his morning chores and helped where he could, mostly hauling boards and holding things in place while Clara nailed them down. Meg sat on an upturned bucket just inside the barn door and issued opinions about the proceedings. By noon, the windbreak was up. It wasn't pretty, but it was solid. Caleb stood back and looked at it. He walked around the corner and stood in the shelter of the new walls, and the wind went quiet, and the cold was suddenly just cold instead of brutal. "Huh," he said. "Give it 3 days," Clara said. "You'll see a difference in the cattle." He didn't say she was right, but he also didn't say she was wrong, which she was learning was approximately the same thing. That evening, Thomas asked her to help with his arithmetic. He spread his school book on the table with the careful reverence of a child who had been doing his lessons alone for a long time and found the company welcome. Clara sat beside him, and they worked through long division for 40 minutes. He was quicker than the material gave him credit for. He finished the problems faster than the book seemed to expect, and when he finished, he looked at her sideways. "Miss Clara," he said. "Just Clara." "Clara." He turned his pencil in his hands. "Do you think Pa's going to be okay?" She'd been expecting the question. She'd been waiting for it in one form or another since the first night. "I think your Pa is someone who has a lot of weight on him right now," she said carefully. "And I think he's been trying to carry it the only way he knows how, which is alone and without complaint. That works for a while. It doesn't work forever." "He cries sometimes," Thomas said. "At night. He thinks I can't hear." "I expect he thinks that's easier for you." Thomas was quiet. "It's not." "No," Clara said. "I know." "Do you think he knows we're still here? Like, really knows it?" He looked up at her, and she saw for just a moment how tired he was. 8 years old and tired in the way that should have been reserved for people several decades older. "Sometimes it feels like he's looking right through us." Clara took a breath. "I think he knows," she said. "I think the problem is that every time he looks at you, he sees your mother, and loving you and missing her are the same feeling right now. They've gotten tangled up." Thomas thought about this for a while. "That sounds really hard." "It is. Is it going to get better?" Clara looked at him honestly. "I don't know for certain, but I've seen people carry things like this, and most of them find their way through. It takes time, and it takes—" She paused, looking for the right word. "It takes something to hold on to while they're finding their way, something that keeps making them show up." "Like the ranch," Thomas said. "Like the ranch," Claire agreed. "And like you and Meg." Thomas nodded slowly, with the considered gravity of a child processing a difficult truth. Then he turned back to his arithmetic book. "Can we do the next page?" he said. Clara moved the lamp a little closer. "Let's do 2. Out. Caleb came in from the barn while they were still at the table. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the scene. Thomas bent over his school book, Clara beside him, the lamp making a warm circle of light in the cold room. And something crossed his face that was gone before Clara could name it. "Supper's kept warm," Clara said without looking up. "There's bread on the board. I made extra. Enough for morning." He came to the table and ate standing up, the way he usually did. But he didn't go back to the barn after. He sat down across from Thomas and watched his son work through a long division problem, and he didn't say anything, but the quality of his silence was different from the silence she'd grown used to. It was the silence of a man who was starting to be present again. Clara didn't comment on it. She just moved the lamp a little so the light fell better on Thomas's page, and outside the wind pushed at the house, and the fire held, and for the first time since she'd arrived, the place felt less like a thing about to fall apart and more like a thing that might, with enough time and care, be put back together. She didn't let herself think about what she was building. Not yet. She just kept showing up and kept her hands busy and let the days do what days do when you stop telling them to hurry. The bread worked on the 3rd try. Clara had watched the first two attempts without saying much, just observed the way she observed everything, quietly and without making it obvious she was doing it. Caleb's problem with the bread wasn't technique exactly, it was temperature. He was setting the dough near the stove to rise, but the stove ran hot and uneven, and the side of the bowl closest to the iron was cooking slightly, while the other side sat cold. The yeast was dying before it could do its work. She mentioned it on the third morning, carefully, while he was already frustrated and elbow-deep in dough. "Try moving it back from the stove about 2 feet," she said, "and cover it with a wool blanket instead of the cloth. Holds the warmth more evenly." He looked at her. "Ruth used a cloth," he said. "I know. It works better in summer. Winter's different. The air's too dry near the iron." He didn't move the bowl immediately. She could see him deciding whether to be stubborn about it. Then he picked it up and moved it back 2 feet and covered it with the blanket that hung over the chair back, and he didn't say another word about it. An hour later, the dough had risen properly for the first time since October. He stood looking at it for a moment before he punched it down. "Don't say it," he said. "I wasn't going to say anything," Clara said, which was true. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The cattle had noticeably improved inside of a week. She'd been right about the windbreak. Cutting the wind off the northwest corner dropped the effective cold by enough that the animals stopped huddling and started moving more naturally, which meant they were burning fewer calories just trying to stay alive. Caleb had checked the feed consumption himself and come in from the barn one evening with a look on his face that she'd started to recognize as him recalibrating something he'd believed for a long time. "They're eating less," he said. Not by a lot, but by something." "It adds up over a winter," Clara said. He sat down and looked at his hands for a moment. "I should have built that windbreak 2 years ago." "You probably had other things going on 2 years ago." "Yeah." A pause. "I did." She let that sit. She'd learned that Caleb didn't need her to respond to everything. What he needed was someone who didn't immediately fill the silence with noise. Ruth had probably known that about him. Clara was figuring it out. "Gerald Pratt came by this morning while you were in the cellar," he said. Clara looked up. "What did he want?" "To be neighborly?" Caleb's voice was completely flat. "Rode up to the fence line, called out, wanted to know how we were getting on." "And?" "And I told him we were fine. He said he'd heard I'd taken on some help and wanted to meet you. I told him you were busy." He looked at Clara. "He didn't believe me about the fine part." "He doesn't believe anyone's fine unless he's the reason," Clara said. Caleb looked at her with something like surprise. Then he made a sound that was close to a laugh, short and rusty, like something that hadn't been used in a while. "That's about right," he said. She didn't push it, but that almost laugh stayed with her longer than it should have. The problem with the east fence took 3 days to fix and should have taken one. The ground wasn't fully frozen yet, which was lucky, but 2 of the posts were rotten at the base and needed to be pulled and replaced, and the nearest stand of timber that had anything suitable was 1.5 miles east across ground that was unreliable with ice in the mornings. Caleb went for the timber. Clara stayed and worked on the section she could handle alone, pulling the old wire tight where it had gone slack, replacing a gate latch that had rusted through, clearing the brush that had grown up along the fence line and would hold snow and drifts against the posts. Thomas came with her on the second afternoon. He was out of school for the week. The school teacher in Harwick Crossing had taken ill, and the school was closed until she recovered. And he'd been underfoot in the house in a way that suggested he needed something to do. "You can pull staples," Clara told him, and handed him the bar. He worked seriously and without complaint, moving down the fence line ahead of her, pulling the old staples so she could restring the wire. He was systematic about it. Put the pulled staples in his coat pocket instead of dropping them on the ground so they wouldn't be lost. Clara noticed this and didn't comment on it, but it struck her. The small, careful habits of a child who'd learned early that things lost couldn't always be replaced. "Can I ask you something?" Thomas said about an hour in. "Go ahead." "How come you left Billings?" Clara kept working. "The operation changed owners. New man wanted to bring in his own people. It wasn't personal." "Where did you go after?" "Couple of places. Worked a summer in a house in Cheyenne, then moved on." Thomas pulled a staple and put it in his pocket. "Don't you have family? Somewhere you want to go back to?" She was quiet for a moment. My folks passed when I was 20. My brothers both went their own ways. One's in California, one I don't know where. We weren't close. That's sad. Sometimes, Clara agreed. Isn't it lonely, moving around? She looked at him. He was watching her with that direct, careful attention he had. The way he asked questions like he actually wanted the answer and wasn't going to accept something vague. Yes, she said honestly. It is. He nodded, satisfied with the answer in some way, and went back to pulling staples. They worked without talking for a while after that, and the quiet between them was the comfortable kind, which Clara had learned to value precisely because it was rarer than noise. Caleb came back with the timber mid-afternoon and they had the new posts in before dark. He worked hard and didn't waste motion, and Clara found herself revising her initial read of him. She'd clocked him as a man operating on fumes, and he was, in terms of emotional reserves. But physically, he knew what he was doing. His hands on a post hole digger were efficient. He set the replacement posts straight without needing to check them twice. What he'd lost wasn't competence. It was will. The belief that the work mattered enough to do it right. She could see it coming back, slowly, like feeling returning to a numb limb. It didn't come back smooth or steady. There were still mornings when he sat at the breakfast table with his coffee going cold, looking at nothing, and the kids moved quietly around him like they were afraid of disturbing something fragile. But the good mornings were getting more frequent. "You're staring," he said, without looking up from the post. "I'm working," Claire said. "You were staring while working." "I was thinking." "About what?" "About how you hold a post," she said, which was not entirely a lie. "You don't check your level." "Don't need to. I can tell by feel." "Can you?" "Been doing it 20 years. "And they're always straight?" He looked at the post. He looked at her. "Pretty much always." "That's either real skill or real luck," Clara said. "With me, it's usually both," he said, and went back to tamping the base, and this time the almost smile was slightly less almost. The trouble with Dorothy Finch started on a Tuesday. Dorothy Finch was the wife of the man who ran the general store in Harwick Crossing, and she was, in the particular social economy of a small frontier town, the woman whose opinion of you determined a great deal about how everyone else treated you. She was not cruel, exactly. She was the kind of woman who operated on a rigid understanding of how things were supposed to be, and who took any deviation from that understanding as a personal affront. Clara had been in the store twice without incident, both times in the early morning when Dorothy wasn't there. On Tuesday, she went in the afternoon. "Mrs. Voss," Dorothy said from behind the counter. The way she said it, the tiny pause before the last name, made clear that the name was in question. "Miss," Clara said pleasantly. "Clara Voss?" "Of course." Dorothy set down what she was writing and folded her hands. "I've been meaning to speak with you. I understand you're working out at the Whitmore place." "That's right." "As a hand." Again the pause. "It's somewhat unusual." "Most useful things are, in my experience." Dorothy's lips pressed together slightly. "I wonder if you understand the position you're placing Mr. Whitmore in. A single man, 2 young children, and a woman who isn't family living on the property." Clara looked at her steadily. "I understand the position he was in before I came, which was a man alone in the cold with 2 young children and a failing ranch. I thought that one was worse." "People talk," Dorothy said. "People talked about the ranch failing for months and nobody offered to help," Clara said. "I'm not sure their opinion is worth what you're giving it." Dorothy blinked. She wasn't used to being answered directly. "I'm only saying that your reputation—" "My reputation is my business," Clara said. "What I'd ask you to consider is Caleb Whitmore's children, who are healthy and warm and fed because someone showed up when they needed it. If that's what people are talking about, then they're welcome to keep talking." She paid for her goods and left. She was halfway to the horse when she heard the door open behind her. "Miss Voss." She turned. It wasn't Dorothy. It was a younger woman, late 20s maybe, with a serious face and red-chapped hands, and the look of someone who worked hard and didn't apologize for it. Clara recognized her vaguely from a previous trip, but didn't know her name. "I'm Helen Marsh," the woman said. "My husband farms the section south of you. I heard what you said in there." A pause. "I thought it needed saying." Clara looked at her. "You're welcome to tell her that yourself." I know. Helen glanced back at the store. I'm not quite brave enough yet. She said it with a small, self-deprecating honesty that Clara found immediately more likable than an ounce of false confidence would have been. But I wanted to say, Bill, my husband, he mentioned that he can see the windbreak you built from his north field. Said it looked solid. It's holding, Claire said. He's thinking about doing something similar for our livestock. Would it be all right if he came by, just to look at how you built it? Tell him to come any morning, Claire said. I'll be there. Helen nodded quickly, like she'd been bracing herself for a different answer. Thank you. She glanced at the store again. She's not bad. She just doesn't like things that don't fit in the place she's put them. I know the type, Claire said. She'll come around. Probably. She doesn't need to come around for me to do my job. Helen looked at her for a moment. No, she said slowly. I suppose she doesn't. And then, with the small, careful smile of a woman who had just decided something, she went back inside. Bill Marsh came on Thursday. He was a tall, taciturn man who said approximately 40 words over 2 hours, but they were well-chosen words, and he looked at the windbreak with the focused attention of someone who was genuinely learning from it rather than just being polite. When he left, he said, "Appreciate it," and that was enough. Caleb had watched from across the yard, not interfering, and when Marsh was gone, he came to where Clara was working on a section of barn siding that needed recaulking. "You know what that means," he said. "What?" "Marsh talking to you. He doesn't talk to people he doesn't respect. He barely talks to people he does respect." "He seems practical," Clara said. "He is." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "He didn't talk to me for the first 2 years after I moved here. I thought he just didn't like me." "What changed?" "I helped him pull a wagon out of a ditch in a rainstorm without being asked." Caleb looked at the road Marsh had taken. "He's been the closest thing I have to a friend since then, which mostly means we nod at each other and occasionally borrow equipment. That's a friendship," Clara said. "It's a quiet one. Some of the best ones are." He looked at her sideways. He did that sometimes. Looked at her sideways. Like looking directly was more than he wanted to commit to. "Did you have people like that?" he said. "In Billings or wherever else?" "Some. A woman named Pearl who ran the cook crew at the Triple B. We'd sit up after supper sometimes and just be somewhere together, not always talking, just there." "You miss that?" "Yes," Claire said. "I do." He was quiet again. The cold had eased slightly over the past few days, a temporary mercy that everyone knew better than to trust, but it made the outdoor work less punishing. Above them, the sky was the hard, pale blue of a November afternoon, and somewhere in the tree line beyond the east pasture, a bird was making noise, which felt almost optimistic. "Clara," Caleb said. She looked at him. "I'm not—" He stopped, started again with the halting quality of a man who'd been working something up to for a while. "I'm not easy to be around right now. I know that. I'm not. Even before Ruth died, I wasn't exactly an easy person. I'm told I'm distant." "You're not distant," Clara said. "You're careful." He looked at her. "There's a difference," she said. "Distant people aren't paying attention. You're paying attention all the time. You're just not sure whether to do anything with what you notice." He considered this. "That's a generous way to put it. It's how I see it. Ruth used to say I thought too much and said too little." "She wasn't wrong," Clara said, "but thinking too much and saying too little is survivable. A lot of things aren't." He almost said something. She could see him turning it over. Then he picked up the caulking brush she'd set down and handed it back to her, and she went back to the siding, and he stayed there a while, not helping exactly, but not leaving either, and that was enough. The problem Gerald Pratt presented crystallized slowly, the way problems do when they're being managed by someone patient enough to wait. Clara hadn't put it together right away. It came together in pieces. A comment from Bill Marsh, a thing Helen said in passing, a letter that Caleb showed her one evening with a careful, neutral expression that didn't hide much. Pratt wanted the water. More specifically, Pratt wanted the creek that ran through the eastern edge of Black Juniper Ranch, a year-round water source in country where year-round water was not guaranteed. Clara had crossed it twice while working the fence line and had noted it without fully understanding its importance. Now she understood. The letter was from a land office in the county seat, formal language, courteous tone, asking Caleb to verify the boundary descriptions on his deed, as there had been some question about survey accuracy on the eastern parcel, nothing threatening on the surface. A routine administrative inquiry. "Is this the first one of these?" Clara asked. "Third," Caleb said. "When did the first one come?" "January of this year, right after Ruth died." He looked at her. "I hadn't connected it that way. When a man's grieving and overwhelmed is when some people think to move," Clara said. She kept her voice even, but her jaw was tight. "When did Pratt first approach you about buying?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "Last spring. He said he wanted to expand his herd, and the eastern pasture made sense, offered me what seemed like a fair price for just that parcel." "Did you look up what the water rights were worth?" The look on his face told her he hadn't. "The pasture's average land," Clara said. "The water is the value. That creek running year-round means whoever controls it controls what every ranch in this valley can do in a dry summer." Caleb sat back in his chair. He said a word under his breath that she'd never heard him use in front of her. "You didn't take his offer," she said. "I didn't. I just didn't get around to answering it. I was—" He stopped. She could fill in what he hadn't gotten around to doing in the months after his wife's death. "He came back in August with a higher number." "And?" "I told him I needed time to think." His jaw worked. "He's been patient, which I know now means he's been waiting for me to get desperate enough." "Or distracted enough," Clara said. "Same thing, I suppose." She looked at the letter again. "This is how it works. They create administrative confusion, questions about the survey, small requests that require you to respond to the county office. And they keep doing it until they find the one time you're too tired or too broke to respond properly. And then they use your non-response as a reason to question the deed." Caleb was staring at the table. "I can't afford a land lawyer." "You don't need one yet," Clara said. "What you need to do is respond to this letter, in writing, to the county office. You confirm your deed is valid, you cite the survey it was based on, and you note that you've responded promptly. That's all. But you do it in writing, and you do it in time." "How do you know all this?" Clara looked at him. "Because Harlan Briggs fought off the same thing for 4 years in Montana. I watched how he did it." She paused. "And because my father lost his homestead in Wyoming when I was 15 for exactly the reason I just described. He didn't respond to a letter because he didn't understand what it meant." She put the letter down on the table. "I understand what it means." Caleb looked at her for a long time. "Can you help me write the response?" he said. "That's why I'm still sitting here." They worked on it at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Clara knew enough of the legal language to frame the response correctly, and Caleb knew the specific details of his deed, when it was filed, by whom, the original survey reference. Thomas fell asleep at the table halfway through, his head resting on his folded arms, and neither of them moved him. When the letter was done, Caleb read it back to himself. He read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and set it on the shelf above the stove where it wouldn't be forgotten. "I owe you something for this," he said. "You owe me breakfast," Clara said. "Same as every morning." He almost smiled, really almost this time. "You're stubborn," he said. "I prefer consistent." "Those aren't the same thing." "Close enough." He looked at Thomas sleeping at the table with a look that Clara had been seeing more frequently, present, taking in the detail of his son in the particular way of a man who was starting to see things again instead of looking through them. He reached over and straightened the boy's arm so his head was better supported. "I'll carry him," Caleb said. "I know," Clara said. He picked Thomas up with the careful ease of long practice and carried him back to his room. Clara put the kettle on and sat in the warm kitchen and listened to the sounds of a father settling his son in for the night. And outside, the wind picked up slightly and moved through the tree line. And she thought about her father's lost homestead and the letter he hadn't understood. And she thought about how things that couldn't be fixed could still, sometimes, be prevented for someone else. The week before the real cold came, Dorothy Finch did something unexpected. She showed up. Not at the feed store, not on the road into town. She drove her husband's wagon out to Black Juniper Ranch on a Wednesday morning and pulled up to the house and called out, and when Clara came to the door, she was holding a covered dish. "I made too much stew," Dorothy said. She said it as though it was slightly irritating that this had happened. "Harold won't eat it for 4 days running, and I won't waste it." Clara looked at the dish, then at Dorothy. "Come inside," Clara said. Dorothy came inside, and she looked around the kitchen with the thorough assessment of a woman cataloging what she saw, and Clara let her look because there was nothing to hide. The kitchen was clean, the fire was properly set, 2 leaves of bread were proving under their blankets on the table, and Meg was sitting in the corner doing absolutely nothing useful with a wooden spoon and a pot, which was how she spent most mornings. "She's well?" Dorothy said, looking at Meg. "She's healthy," Clara said. "Stubborn, but healthy." "Caleb's children were always healthy," Dorothy said, with an unexpected tightness in her voice. "Ruth saw to that. Ruth was—" She stopped. "She was a careful mother." "The children talk about her," Clara said. Dorothy set the stew down on the table and straightened up and looked at Clara directly for the first time since she'd walked in. "I wasn't kind to you in the store," she said. "I was managing something that wasn't really about you." Clara waited. "Ruth was my friend," Dorothy said simply. "My closest friend. And watching this place, watching Caleb fall to pieces after she died was—" She pressed her lips together. "I didn't want someone to come in and just cover it over, like she hadn't been here." "I know," Clara said. "Do you?" "I've been careful not to do that," Clara said. "The things Ruth built, the systems she had, the ways she ran this house, I've worked around them where I can. Changed what needed changing for practical reasons. Left the rest." Dorothy was quiet. She looked at the bread under the blankets. "That's her method," she said. "The wool for rising." "I know, Thomas told me." Clara looked at her. "I'm not trying to replace what she was. I don't think that's possible, and I don't think it should be tried." Dorothy sat down at the table without being invited. Meg toddled over and looked up at her with the frank curiosity of a 4-year-old, and Dorothy looked down at her with an expression that shifted into something softer. "Hello, Margaret," Dorothy said. "Dottie," Meg said with the authority of someone who had already assigned a nickname and was not open to discussion. Dorothy let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "She's been calling me that since she could talk," she said. "Drove Ruth absolutely crazy." "She calls me Kawa," Clara said. Dorothy looked at her. Then she did laugh, short and genuine, and it changed her whole face. They had tea while the stew warmed. Dorothy didn't stay long, as she was a woman with things to do and didn't linger past what the situation called for, but when she left, she paused in the doorway. "There's a gathering at the Marsh place in 2 weeks," she said. "For the winter. People bring food and spend the afternoon. You should come." A pause. "Both of you. Caleb hasn't come to one in over a year." "I'll mention it to him," Claire said. "He'll say he's busy." "He might be." "He won't be," Dorothy said flatly. "He'll just be afraid of what it feels like to sit in a room with people who knew Ruth." She met Clara's eyes. "Tell him Helen Marsh asked specifically." Clara nodded. "I will." Dorothy left. Clara stood in the doorway and watched the wagon go, and then Meg pulled at her skirt and held up the wooden spoon and said something entirely incomprehensible but clearly urgent, and Clara went back inside to deal with whatever catastrophe was developing at pot level. She told Caleb about the gathering that evening. As Dorothy had predicted, he said he was busy. Clara told him Helen Marsh had asked specifically, which gave him pause. She told him the children should go, that Thomas needed to be around other children his age outside of school, and that this was inarguable. He agreed, after a silence, that the children should go. "And you?" she said. "What about me?" "Are you coming?" "I don't—" He stopped, looked at the fire. "I haven't been to one of those since Ruth." "I know." People will be glad to see you," Clara said. "And then it'll be awkward for about 20 minutes, and then it'll stop being awkward, and then it'll just be an afternoon. That's how those things go." He didn't answer. "You can't stay out here for the rest of your life," she said carefully. "I'm not—" "You are," she said, not unkindly. "You're doing the work. You're keeping the ranch going, you're being present for your children, but you've cut yourself off from everything outside this fence line. That's not surviving. That's just a smaller kind of not being here. He looked at her. She'd gone further than she usually allowed herself, and she felt it, the slight overstep. But she didn't take it back. Dorothy Finch came out here today, she said. She brought stew and sat at your kitchen table and laughed at your daughter. Things are changing. Let them. Caleb was quiet for a long time. Then he said very quietly, "Was it hard? When you walked away from things? Places? People?" "Yes," Clara said. "Did you get used to it?" "No." She looked at him honestly. "You don't get used to it. You just get better at knowing that something can hurt and still be survivable." He absorbed this. He turned it over the way he turned most things over, slowly and without rushing. "I'll go," he said finally, "to the marsh gathering." "Good. Don't make it a bigger thing than it is." "I wasn't going to," Clara said. She went back to mending the wool sock in her lap, and he went back to looking at the fire, and the house held its warmth around them, and the cold outside pressed at the windows and found no way in. It was, Clara thought, the most ordinary evening she'd had in years. She didn't let herself think too much about what that meant. The marsh gathering happened on a Saturday, and Caleb almost backed out twice before they left. The first time was at breakfast, when he came to the table already dressed, and then sat down and said nothing and stared at his coffee until Clara put a plate in front of him and said, without looking at him, "You're going." The second time was when he had the horse hitched to the wagon and stood beside it for a long moment with his hand on the mare's neck, and Thomas looked up at him from the wagon bed with the careful, watchful expression he got when he wasn't sure which way his father was going to go. "Pa," Thomas said. "I know," Caleb said. He climbed up and took the reins. They rode in silence for the first mile. Meg sat between Clara and Caleb on the bench and provided a running commentary on everything she saw. A crow, a frozen puddle, a fence post that had fallen over. And her narration filled the silence in a way that made it easier for everyone. Thomas sat in the wagon bed with his back against the sideboards and watched the sky. "Thomas," Caleb said without turning. "Yeah." "Your mother liked the marsh gatherings." He said it quietly, like he was putting something down gently. "She always made her oatcake to bring. People asked about it every year." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "I remember. I just wanted to say that." A pause. "Before we got there." Thomas leaned forward and put his hand briefly on his father's shoulder. It lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then he sat back and went back to watching the sky, and Caleb kept his eyes on the road, and Clara kept her eyes on the road too, and didn't say anything at all. The marsh place was louder and fuller than Clara had expected. 11 families in a territory this sparse felt like a crowd, and the warmth of the marsh barn, where Bill had set up long tables and a second stove for the occasion, hit her in the face when she walked through the door. Children were already running. Someone had a fiddle out. Helen Marsh appeared almost immediately, with flour on her sleeve and the look of a woman who had been managing 17 simultaneous things and was genuinely glad to have one more person arrive. "You came," she said to Caleb first, and her voice had something in it that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite relief, but was somewhere between the two. "Clara threatened me," Caleb said. "I suggested strongly," Clara said. Helen laughed and took Meg from Clara's arms and introduced her around with the ease of someone who was comfortable with children in a way that Clara recognized. Not the performance of being good with children, but the real thing. Thomas had already found someone his age and disappeared into the pack of running kids. Caleb stood near the door for a moment, with the stiff look of a man who had walked into a room that held a version of his life he was still learning how to inhabit. And then Jim Dalby, the farrier who'd sent Clara to him in the first place, came over and said something quietly and put a hand on Caleb's arm, and Caleb's shoulders came down about an inch from where they'd been. Clara moved away. She'd learned that Caleb didn't need to be watched over, and more importantly, she knew that him seeing her watching over him was more uncomfortable than useful. She found Helen's food table and made herself useful there, and Dorothy Finch appeared beside her 20 minutes in and handed her a ladle without comment, and they worked side by side through the lunch service with the comfortable efficiency of 2 practical women who'd decided without saying so that they were going to manage this together. "He's talking to Jim," Dorothy said, at one point, nodding across the barn. "Good," Clara said. He and Jim used to fish together, before. Dorothy handed a bowl to a child who was too small to reach the table. Jim felt like he lost both of them when Ruth went. Caleb disappeared and Jim didn't know how to push. Jim seemed like a man who'd push in exactly the right amount, Clara said. That's why I sent him over the moment Caleb walked in the door, Dorothy said, and went back to ladling stew like she hadn't just admitted to a year's worth of careful management. Clara liked her considerably more than she'd expected to. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had shifted into the loose, unhurried ease of people who'd eaten well and had nowhere urgent to be. The children had worn themselves down to a manageable roar. The fiddle player had found a second person to play with, a woman with a small drum, and the music had gotten better for the addition. Clara was near the back of the barn when Gerald Pratt arrived. She didn't see him come in. She heard him because Gerald Pratt had a voice calibrated to carry, and he was using it at full strength on Bill Marsh before he'd even properly cleared the doorway. Bill, I keep telling you, you ought to put a proper floor in here before next gathering. Ground's like iron. Man could turn an ankle. Bill Marsh said something inaudible. Pratt laughed at it, too loud, the laugh of a man who laughs at his own humor preemptively. He found Caleb inside of 10 minutes. Clara watched from across the barn, not moving closer, but watching. Pratt put his hand on Caleb's shoulder with the practiced ease of a man used to making physical contact look friendly when it wasn't. Said something. Caleb's face didn't change much, but his jaw went tight the way it did when he was managing his response. Jim Dalby stayed beside Caleb. Clara noted that with satisfaction. Pratt said something else, longer this time, leaning slightly in, and then his eyes moved across the barn and found Clara. He looked at her for a moment with the particular look of a man recalculating, and then he said something to Caleb that made Caleb turn and look at her too. She crossed the barn. Miss Voss, Pratt said as she arrived, and his smile was the performance she'd seen before. I hear you've been quite the addition to Black Juniper Ranch. I've been doing my job, Clara said. Of course, of course. He looked at Caleb. Got the east fence fixed, I hear, and some kind of windbreak for the cattle? Standard winter preparations, Clara said. Smart. He nodded with the exaggerated appreciation of a man who doesn't mean it. Though I keep wondering, and you'll forgive me, Caleb, I'm just being practical. At what point a property that needs this much remediation becomes more work than it's worth? For everyone involved. It's worth it to me, Caleb said. Sure, sure. Pratt looked at Clara. You got him writing letters to the county office, I hear. The room was loud enough that no one nearby could follow the conversation, but Clara felt the attention of Jim Dalby sharpening beside her, and she kept her own voice easy. Anyone receiving correspondence from a county land office should respond to it promptly. That's just good practice. Absolutely, absolutely. Pratt's smile didn't move. Though I'd hate for Caleb to waste time and effort fighting an administrative process that's just going to end up where it ends up regardless. Sometimes a clean sale. Caleb's not selling, Clara said. Pratt looked at her, then at Caleb. I'm not selling, Caleb said. His voice was flat and final, with none of the uncertainty that might have been in it 2 months ago. Pratt held his smile for another beat, then he nodded once like he was acknowledging a move in a game, and changed the subject to crop prices, and didn't come back to the land again. But Clara watched him work the room for the rest of the afternoon, and she saw the pattern. The conversations he pulled men into one at a time, the hand on the shoulder, the laugh, the leaning in. She didn't know exactly what he was saying, but she knew the shape of it. He was building something, not urgently, patiently. Patient was the word she kept coming back to. The storm came on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the gathering. It had been threatening for days. Clara felt it in the way the temperature dropped at night, not the gradual fall of a normal cold snap, but something steeper, like a door being closed. The sky had gone the wrong color 2 days before, a flat, pale gray without depth, and the cattle had been restless in a way that animals get when something in the air is telling them things that humans aren't paying attention to. Clara was paying attention. She spent Monday reinforcing the windbreak, adding another row of bales to the top, double-checking the canvas fastenings. She moved the most vulnerable cattle, a heifer that had been borderline all month and 2 of the older cows, into the barn itself and bedded them heavily. She checked the firewood for the house. They had good supply, but she brought an extra cord onto the porch and covered it with canvas so it would stay accessible without digging through snow. She tested every window latch in the house and found two that were loose and fixed them. "You're expecting something bad," Caleb said, watching her on Tuesday evening as she checked the rope she'd installed between the house and the barn the previous week. A guide rope, her idea, something she'd seen used in Montana, strung chest high between the buildings so that if visibility dropped to nothing, you could still navigate between them. "I'm expecting something bad," she confirmed. "How bad?" "I don't know exactly." She tested the tension on the rope. "But bad enough that I want this to be something you can find in the dark." He looked at the rope. She'd run it with 3 separate ties at the barn end and 2 at the house end, with enough slack that it wouldn't pull the anchor posts if someone fell and grabbed it hard. "That's a Montana trick," he said. "Yes. I've never needed one of those here before." "I know." She finished checking the last tie. "I hope you don't need it this week either." She could tell he wasn't sure whether to take her seriously or treat it as overcaution. He was a man who'd managed winters on this land for years, and there was a natural resistance to being told you'd been underprepared. But he'd watched her be right enough times that the resistance was thinner than it used to be. "What else?" he said. "The shutters on the north windows. Close them tonight and latch them. If it's as bad as I think it'll be, open windows are going to cost us heat we can't afford to lose." She paused. "And I want to move the grain supply in closer. If we get drifts, the outbuilding might be buried." "That's 2 hours of work tonight." "Yes," Clara said. He looked at the sky, the wrong color, the flat pale gray without depth. "All right," he said. They worked until past dark. Thomas helped with the grain, hauling sacks from the outbuilding to the barn in relay while Clara and Caleb stacked. Meg was inside under Dorothy Finch's strict instruction. Dorothy had come by that afternoon for unrelated reasons and had simply stayed when she understood what was being prepared for, which was, Clara was realizing, exactly the kind of person Dorothy Finch was when the situation was clear enough to cut through her social habits. "You need to have water inside," Dorothy said, when Clara came in to check the stove. "If the well freezes over or drifts in, you'll want a reserve." She was already filling every pot and container she could find. "I learned this from my mother. You think you have time to get water, and then you don't." "Thank you," Clara said. "Don't thank me. I've been through 3 of these in this valley. You get smart, or you get miserable." She filled another pot. "Or both." The storm hit in the early hours of Thursday morning. Clara woke at 2 in the morning to a sound she recognized before she was fully awake. The sound of wind that had shifted from a weather event into something with intent, a sustained roar that made the house feel smaller. She dressed in the dark, moving fast, and went to the stove and loaded it heavy, and then went to the window and could not see past the glass. Not darkness. White. The snow was coming sideways, and there was so much of it that her lamp reflected back at her from the window like the world had stopped at the porch rail. She heard Caleb's door open. He came into the kitchen fully dressed, which meant he'd been awake or had woken when she had, and he crossed to the window and stood beside her and looked out. "Well?" he said. "Yes," Clara said. "Cattle." "Barn's holding," she said. "The windbreak is going to take the worst of the north wind, but we need to check in 4 hours, make sure the snow isn't loading on the canvas roof." "I'll go now." "We'll go at 6, she said. "With the rope. Not now." He looked at the window, the white nothing beyond it. "You're right," he said, which still cost him something to say, and she respected him for saying it anyway. They kept the stove fed through the night in shifts. At 5:30, the wind had not let up and may have gotten worse, and Caleb made the trip to the barn on the guide rope while Clara held her position at the house end and felt the rope go taut and then slack in a rhythm as he moved hand over hand through air that was essentially solid white. He was gone for 40 minutes. She did not let herself think about the 40 minutes as they passed. He came back the same way, emerging from the white at the porch rail with snow packed into every crease of his coat and his face completely unreadable under the ice in his beard. "Windbreak held," he said, shaking snow off in the porch. "Canvas has some load on it, but it's holding the angle right. I cleared the worst of it off. Lost 1 bale off the top. Wind got under it, but the structure's intact." "The heifer?" "Moving around. She's okay." He stomped his boots. 2 of the other cattle are down just resting. I think they're all right. Hard to tell in there with the noise. We go back at noon, Clara said. I know. They went inside. Thomas was awake and sitting by the stove with Meg in his lap, both of them in their heaviest clothes, and he looked up when they came in with the controlled expression he put on when he was scared and didn't want to show it. How bad is it? He said. Bad, Caleb said. But we're okay. The prep work held. He looked at Thomas for a moment. The rope idea was a good one. Thomas glanced at Clara. Clara didn't say anything. It was Miss Clara's idea, Thomas said. I know whose idea it was, Caleb said. He went to the stove and poured coffee. I'm saying it was a good one. Gut. By noon, the storm had been going for 10 hours and showed no sign of shortening its stay. The world outside the windows was still white and loud, and the drifts that Clara could see by pressing her face to the glass were building against the north wall of the house in a way that concerned her, not structurally, but in terms of the door. If they drifted in past a certain point, they'd lose easy access to the porch and the rope. She and Caleb went out together at noon. 2 people on the rope, 6 feet apart, hands never off the line. The barn seemed impossibly far for a distance of 60 yards. When they got there, the warmth of the animals hit them, and Clara moved through the stalls methodically while Caleb checked the structure. The heifer was standing. That was good. The canvas had loaded again on the windbreak, and it took them both 20 minutes in the screaming wind to clear it, working by touch as much as by sight, and when they came back inside, Clara's hands were shaking enough that she couldn't hold her coffee cup and had to set it down. Hands, Caleb said. They're fine. Let me see. She held them out. He took them both in his and held them, and the warmth was immediate and slightly startling, and she looked at some point past his left shoulder while her hands stopped shaking. You need better gloves, he said. I know. I'll get some in town when this is over. He held her hands for another moment, then let go and picked up her coffee cup and put it back in her hands. Drink that, he said. She drank it. But it was Thomas who heard it first. They were into the second afternoon of the storm, sitting through the hours the way you sit through serious weather, feeding the stove, keeping the children occupied, moving between vigilance and the particular exhaustion that comes from sustained alertness. When Thomas went to the window and pressed his face against it and said, There's something outside. Claire and Caleb were at the table. They both looked up. Animal? Caleb said. I don't know. I think it's someone calling. They listened. Under the roar of the wind, barely audible, something irregular. Not the wind sound, which was sustained and tonal. This was broken up, pattern-like. Caleb was on his feet. Don't, Clara said. Someone's out there. I know. Put your coat on first. He put his coat on and Clara put hers on, and they went to the porch, and Clara held the door from pulling wide and losing heat, and they both stood in the gap and listened. There. Broken, exhausted, coming from the direction of the east fence line. Someone was calling. It's Pratt's property past the east fence, Caleb said. I know. They looked at each other. The wind screamed between them. I'm going, Caleb said. The rope only reaches the barn. I know. I'll need a second line from the barn east. He was already looking at the rope, calculating. I've got a long coil in the barn. If I can get to the barn first, Clara said. Clara. She said again. I hold the barn end. You go east. That way there's still someone on the anchor. He looked at her for 1 second. Then he said, Let's go. They crossed to the barn on the guide rope. The calling was louder now, east and south, with a note in it that Clara recognized as someone who had been calling for a long time and was running out of voice to do it with. In the barn, Caleb found the long coil of hemp rope, 60 feet, good weight, and tied one end to the barn's east post and the other around his waist, and Clara took a grip on the rope 2 feet from the barn post. Stay here, he said. I'm not going anywhere, she said. He went into the white. She stood in the barn doorway with the rope in her hands and the sound of the storm around her, and she counted. The rope played out foot by foot as he moved east. 20 feet, 30. The coil in her hands getting lighter, 40 feet. She felt the rope go taut, and then slack and then taut again, which meant he was moving through drifts, not steady ground. Then the rope went still. She held it. 10 seconds. 20. Then it moved. 2 sharp pulls, which was what they'd agreed meant he'd found something. She held the barn post and held the rope and waited. The 2 sharp pulls came again, then the rope started moving back toward her. More weight on it now, pulling it sideways. They came out of the white at 40 feet. 2 of them. Caleb with his arm around a man who was not walking under his own power very well, lurching through a drift that came up past his knees, and behind them, and this was what stopped Clara's breath for a moment, a horse, following because Caleb had somehow gotten a lead on it. It was Ed Cutter, Pratt's foreman. A man in his 50s who'd been riding fence on Pratt's east property and had lost his horse in the white and wandered wrong and had been in the open for she didn't know how long. His face was the color of old wax, and he couldn't fully close his right hand. They got him inside the barn. Clara got his outer layer off and got blankets from the tack room and packed them around him while Caleb dealt with the horse, which was cold and frightened and needed handling before it hurt someone. Ed Cutter said almost nothing. He was past the point where talking seemed possible. He just sat against the barn wall with his teeth going and let Clara work around him. "The fingers," she said to Caleb when he came over. Caleb crouched and looked at Cutter's right hand. The 2 middle fingers were white and waxy at the tips, the kind of cold damage that needed warmth fast and carefully, not fast and harsh. Clara showed Caleb what to do with them. Not hot water, not rubbing, just held against warm skin. And Caleb held the man's damaged hand between both of his own with a patience and steadiness that Clara noticed without commenting on. Ed Cutter looked down at Caleb's hands holding his. "I've said things," Cutter said, hoarse and rough. "About you and your place," that Pratt said. "I know," Caleb said. "You didn't have to come out." "Yes, I did," Caleb said simply. "You got anybody else going to ride Pratt's east fence in a blizzard who knows where the fences are?" Cutter almost laughed. The sound was broken and tired, and nothing like a real laugh, but it was something. "His barn is better than mine," Caleb said to Clara. "We can't move him in this. He stays here tonight." Clara had already reached the same conclusion. "I'll get food from the house. Use the rope." "That was my plan," she said. She made the trip twice. Food on the first run, bread, the remains of the morning stew in a covered pot, and on the second run she brought Thomas's extra blankets and her own, because the barn was warm by barn standards, but not warm by sick man standards, and Ed Cutter needed everything they had to give him right now. Thomas was at the door when she came in for the second time. "Is someone hurt?" he said. "Mr. Cutter, he was out in the storm. He's okay, but he needs the blankets." She picked them up from Thomas's arms. "I need you to keep the stove loaded for the next 2 hours. Can you do that?" "Yes," Thomas said, without hesitation. "Good." She looked at him. "You're doing well. Is Pa okay?" "Your Pa," Clara said, "went out into a blizzard on a 60-foot rope to pull a man back from the edge of something very bad. He's fine. He's exactly fine." She held Thomas's eyes for a moment. "He's the man you're going to be." Thomas swallowed. He picked up the wood. Ed Cutter survived the night. By morning, the storm had moved on. Not immediately, the way spring storms sometimes broke, but in the gradual way of serious winter weather, the wind dropping by degrees through the early hours until by 8 in the morning there was only quiet and a white landscape that looked like something that had never been loud. The drifts against the north wall of the house were 4 feet deep. The guide rope was buried to the halfway point. Clara found it by feel, dug it out, and cleared the line between the house and the barn. And by the time she was done, Caleb had come out to help, and they worked in the specific companionable silence of 2 people who'd been through something together and hadn't sorted out yet what to do with that fact. Ed Cutter's fingers were going to be all right. The tips had blistered overnight, but the damage was surface level, not the deep cold that took parts off. He sat up in the barn on his second morning and ate bread and looked at the shape of the structure around him. "That windbreak," he said to Clara, who was checking on the heifer. "Yes. I saw it when I was coming in. Couldn't see anything else, just white, but I could see the outline of it because it was higher than the drift line. I used it to orient myself." He stopped. "That's what told me I was close to something. That's why I started calling." Clara straightened up and looked at him. Pratt said it was foolish, Cutter said without looking at her. When he heard you'd built it, said it was a woman's panic building, putting up a hay bale wall against a winter that'd knock it flat. He looked at his wrapped hand. He said a lot of things. Clara didn't say anything. He won't hear about this from me, Cutter said. What you did, coming out for me. He glanced up. I mean Caleb. I know what you mean, Clara said. You built the wall, he said. And I found it in the white. That's what it is. He left that morning, once the road was passable, riding his recovered horse back across the east fence line to Pratt's property. He didn't say much when he went. He shook Caleb's hand for a long time, and he nodded at Clara, and he rode away through the white landscape without looking back. Caleb watched him go. He's not a bad man, Caleb said. No, Clara agreed. He works for a bad idea. That's different. Caleb considered this. The morning was sharp and clean and very still after the violence of the previous 2 days, the sky back to its honest winter blue. The windbreak was still standing. The canvas had gone, ripped off in the night at some point, but the bale structure was intact, only slightly shifted, and 3 of Pratt's own cattle, who had drifted before Cutter could stop them, were standing in its shelter, having found the thing by the same instinct Cutter had. We'll need to rebuild the canvas roof, Caleb said. This week, Clara said. I know. He looked at the cattle. I'll send word to Pratt that his cattle are here. He'll send someone for them. I expect he will. He turned and looked at the house. The drifts against the north wall, the buried rope line she'd dug out, the shuttered windows waiting to be reopened. We came through it, he said. We did. Because of the prep work. Because of the prep work, Clara agreed. And because you went out on a 60-foot rope in zero visibility for a man you don't particularly like. That wasn't prep work. No, she said. That was just who you are. He looked at her. The particular sideways look had been replaced with something more direct, something that he hadn't quite managed before, and it lasted only a moment before he looked back at the house. Thomas kept the stove going all night, he said. I know. I checked twice. He's a good kid. He's going to be a remarkable man, Claire said. He already is, mostly. Caleb was quiet for a moment. I know I've been not here. For him, for Meg, these past months. You've been finding your way back. I've been slow about it. Grief doesn't run on a schedule, Claire said, and you're here now. He looked at her for a long moment. Really looked. The kind of looking that didn't slide sideways after a second. She held it. Clara, he said. Don't say anything you're going to want to take back, she said gently. I wasn't going to say anything complicated. All right. I was going to say thank you. He said it simply, without decoration. For what you did. All of it. I know what this place looked like when you got here. And I know what it looks like now, and I know the distance between those two things is mostly— He stopped, reworked it. Is largely you. It's partly me, Clara said. The rest is you not quitting. I thought about it. I know you did. You didn't. He nodded once. The nod that meant something was settled. The windbreak needs a new canvas roof, he said again. I'll measure the frame this afternoon, Clara said. They walked back toward the house together through the snow, not quite side by side, but close to it. And the morning was cold and clear, and the ranch was still standing, and that was not nothing at all. The new canvas roof on the windbreak went up on a Tuesday, 8 days after the storm. Bill Marsh came to help. He arrived without being asked, pulling up in his wagon with a roll of heavy canvas in the bed and 2 of his own barn boards for cross-bracing, and he tied his horse at the rail and walked to where Caleb was measuring the bale structure and said, I heard yours tore off. I had some extra. Caleb looked at the canvas. That's good canvas. I know it is, Bill said. Don't make a thing of it. They worked through the morning, the 3 of them, Marsh and Caleb on the heavy lifting, Clara directing the angle of the roof pitch so the snow would shed rather than load. The temperature had come back up to something bearable after the storm. Still cold, but the working kind of cold rather than the dangerous kind, and by noon the new roof was in place and the structure was better than it had been before the blizzard. Marsh stood back and looked at it. My windbreak's not holding as well as this one, he said to Clara. "I did mine differently." "The pitch on your roof is too flat," she said. "Snow loads on it instead of sliding off. You want more angle." "How much more?" She showed him with her hands. He looked at her hands and then at his own canvas roofline, calculating. "I can fix that in a day," he said. "I know you can." He glanced at Caleb. "Your woman knows more about winter building than any man in this valley." Caleb looked at Clara, and Clara looked at the windbreak, and neither of them addressed the phrase "your woman" directly, which was its own kind of statement. "She knows more than I do," Caleb said simply. "That's what matters." Marsh nodded like that was the sensible position and went to get his horse. Word of Ed Cutter had moved through the valley the way word always moved in places with few enough people that everyone's business was eventually everyone's business. Clara didn't know exactly how it traveled. She hadn't told anyone, Caleb hadn't told anyone, and Cutter himself had said he wouldn't tell Pratt. But by the second week after the storm, people knew. Not the details, but the shape of it. That someone from Black Juniper Ranch had gone out in the worst blizzard in 3 years on a rope and brought Pratt's foreman back from something serious. Dorothy Finch brought it up directly, because Dorothy Finch always brought things up directly once she'd decided they needed to be said. "People are talking about what Caleb did," she said. She was at the kitchen table, which had become a place she arrived at approximately twice a week without particular announcement, a habit that had developed so gradually that none of them had noticed when it became normal. "About the rope and going out in that." "Let them talk," Caleb said from across the table. He was mending a piece of harness and not looking up. "It's good talk," Dorothy said. "That's what I'm telling you. For once in this valley, the talk is good." "Ed Cutter's a man who needed help," Caleb said. "That's the whole of it." Dorothy looked at Clara. Clara kept her expression neutral. "Gerald Pratt hasn't said anything," Dorothy continued, "about the cattle you kept either. 3 of his cattle sheltered in your windbreak during the storm, and you fed them for 2 days and sent them back without a word about cost." "They were hungry," Caleb said. "Caleb," Dorothy set her cup down, "I'm trying to tell you that the way people see this ranch has changed. The way they see you has changed. You can be modest about it, or you can acknowledge that it matters. Because it does. When you need something, help with the spring herd, access to the mill, someone to vouch for your deed at the county office, people remember things like what happened in that blizzard. That's not nothing." Caleb finally looked up from the harness. He looked at Dorothy and then at Clara. "She's right," Clara said. He went back to the harness. "I know she's right," he said. "I'm just not comfortable with it." "You don't have to be comfortable with it," Dorothy said. "You just have to let it be true." The letter from the county land office came on a Friday, 2 weeks after the storm. Clara was in the barn when Caleb brought it in from the road, and she knew from the way he stood in the barn doorway holding it, the particular stillness of a man who's looking at something he doesn't entirely want to open, that it was the land office again. "Third response?" she said. "Fourth," he said. "I didn't tell you about the one in December." She set down what she was holding and crossed to him and took the letter and opened it herself, because sometimes the person who doesn't have the emotional stake in a thing is the one who should read it first. It was longer than the previous ones. The formal language was the same, but this one had a new element, a reference to a competing claim filed by a third party regarding the survey accuracy of the eastern parcel. The third party was not named explicitly, but the filing number was there, and Clara knew a filing number could be traced. "He filed a competing claim," she said. "Pratt?" "Almost certainly." She read it again. "He didn't wait for you to be desperate. He went ahead and filed on his own to create the dispute formally. That's a different move than the letters." Caleb's jaw was working. "What does it mean?" "It means he's escalating. He's moved from suggestion to action." She folded the letter and looked at Caleb. "It also means he made a mistake, because now there's a formal record that can be formally answered. I still can't afford a lawyer. You might not need one for the first step." She went to the house immediately, and Caleb followed, and she sat at the kitchen table and read the letter a third time, slowly, looking at the specific claims being made. The competing claim is based on a survey dispute. He's arguing that your deed's survey reference has an error in the boundary description. Do you have the original survey document? Somewhere. Find it. He found it in 40 minutes, in the bottom of a wooden box under his bed that also contained Ruth's good earrings, the children's birth certificates, and a photograph that he set face down on the bed without comment before digging out the survey document and bringing it to Clara. She spread it on the table. It was old, the paper brittle at the folds, but the survey marks were clear and the description was detailed. She read it against the language in the land office letter, and she found what she was looking for inside of 10 minutes. "The creek," she said. "What about it?" Pratt's claim is that the creek falls outside your eastern boundary per the original survey. He's arguing the survey line runs west of the creek, not east of it. She pointed to the document. But look at this notation. The surveyor used the creek itself as a reference marker. The boundary is defined as running along the east bank. That means the creek is inside your boundary by definition. The creek can't be the marker and also be outside the boundary. It's one or the other. Caleb leaned over the table and looked at where she was pointing. He was quiet for a long time. "Pratt's lawyer would have seen that," he said. "Yes." "So either his lawyer missed it, which I doubt, or he's hoping you don't catch it," Clara said, "or that you can't explain it clearly enough to the county office to matter." She looked at him. "The county land office doesn't make legal determinations. They forward disputes to a land commissioner. But the way you frame your response to this letter affects which way they lean when they forward it. What do I say? You cite the survey language exactly. You point out that the creek is used as a reference marker in the original document, which by definition places the eastern boundary at the creek's east bank. You attach a copy of the survey, and you note that you're responding promptly to every correspondence, which establishes your engagement with the process." She paused. "And we send a copy to Jim Dalby." Caleb looked at her. "Jim's a farrier. Jim's a man who's been in this valley for 20 years and knows everyone in it, including whoever sits on the county land board. His name on a letter as a local witness doesn't hurt. You can't send a farrier's letter to a land commissioner. You're not sending it to the commissioner. You're sending it to Jim, informally, explaining the situation and asking if he knows anyone at the county seat who might be interested in a survey interpretation question." She looked at him. "Pratt has a lawyer. You have something Pratt doesn't." "What's that?" "People who actually like you." Caleb sat back in his chair and looked at the survey document. He looked at the letter. He rubbed his face with both hands in the way he did when he was processing something that required him to rearrange what he'd thought was true. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "How long have you known this was coming? That he'd escalate like this?" She considered being careful about the answer. Then she decided he deserved the honest one. "Since the gathering, I watched him work the room. He's not a man who moves once. He moves in layers. The letters were the first layer. This is the second. I've been thinking about the third." "What's the third?" "I don't know yet, but it'll come after he sees how we respond to this one." She looked at him steadily. "Which is why we respond to this one right." He nodded. The nod that meant he'd decided. They wrote the response that evening, and this time it was collaborative in a way the first letter hadn't been. Caleb knowing the land and the history, Clara knowing the language and the legal logic, the two of them working back and forth until the document said what needed to be said in the clearest possible terms. Thomas fell asleep at the table again. Meg had gone to bed at 7 with Dorothy, who had been recruited for the evening because someone needed to keep the children out of the kitchen while the adults worked. When it was done, Caleb read it all the way through. He set it down. "It's good," he said. "It's accurate," Clara said. "That's what matters." "Same thing, in a legal document." "Not always, but in this one, yes." He looked at her across the table. The lamp between them made the light warm and uneven, and the house was quiet, and outside the January dark was complete and cold and still. "When this is over," he said carefully, "what happens?" Clara looked at him. "I mean," he stopped, restarted. "You came for the winter. That was the agreement, room and board." "That was the agreement," she said. "Spring is about 3 months out." "About that. I don't want to—" He put his hands flat on the table in the way he did when he was trying to be precise and was frustrated with his own imprecision. "I don't know how to ask what I want to ask without it coming out wrong." "Try anyway," Clara said. He looked at her. "Do you have somewhere to go when spring comes?" She was quiet for a moment. Not specifically. Is there somewhere you want to go? She thought about Pearl in Billings. She thought about her brother in California, whose address she hadn't had in 2 years. She thought about the string of winters in other people's places, useful and temporary, moving on when the situation resolved. Not particularly, she said. Caleb nodded slowly. He picked up the letter and folded it with great care along the lines she'd creased. The ranch is going to need a lot of work come spring, he said, beyond what I can do alone. Most ranches do. I'm not asking as an employer, he said. I want to be clear about that. Clara looked at him. He was looking back at her, direct this time, without the sideways deflection, and she could see what it cost him to be direct. Not the asking itself, but the making himself legible. The lowering of the careful distance he kept between himself and the possibility of being disappointed. I know you're not, she said. I don't know how to do this, he said. I haven't, since Ruth. I don't know how any of it works anymore. What's appropriate? What's fair to you? What's fair to the kids? Caleb, she said, I'm probably doing this wrong. You're doing it honestly, she said. That's not wrong. She looked at him across the lamp. I'm not going anywhere in spring. Not unless you ask me to. He was very still. I'm not going to ask you to, he said. Good, she said. Then we don't have a problem. He let out a breath he'd probably been holding for weeks. She watched his shoulders drop to somewhere closer to their natural position, and she thought about how much energy it took to hold yourself that tightly, that long, waiting for a thing you didn't know how to ask for. Good, he said. And then, after a pause, with the ghost of something that was finally a real smile. Good. The change in the valley came gradually, the way real changes tend to. Not a single moment, but an accumulation of small ones that you only recognized as a pattern when you look back at them. Jim Dalby came by the week after they sent the letter and sat at the kitchen table with Caleb for 2 hours, and Clara gave them coffee and stayed out of it because this was Caleb's conversation to have. When Dalby left, he stopped on the porch and said quietly to Clara, I know a man at the county assessor's office who did his apprenticeship under the original land surveyor in this district. He'd have an opinion about that survey language. He put his hat on. I'll write to him. Thank you, Clara said. Don't thank me yet. He stepped off the porch. Pratt's got a lawyer from the city. This won't be easy. I know, Clara said, but easy wasn't the requirement. He looked at her for a moment. No, he said, I suppose it wasn't. The second thing was Helen Marsh. Helen arrived one morning in early February with a problem and the directness to state it plainly. Her husband's cattle had come through the storm in decent shape, but the windbreak rebuild had gone wrong. He'd overcorrected the pitch, and now the canvas roof was pulling at the anchor points and was going to tear if they got another serious snowfall. Can you come look at it? Helen said. Bill won't ask. He thinks he should have gotten it right the first time. Tell him I'll come Wednesday, Claire said. He'll say he doesn't need... Tell him I want to look at his bale placement because I've been thinking about a modification to the structure that I want to try on a different property first before I do it on ours, Claire said. Helen blinked. Then she understood, and a small smile appeared. That's very diplomatically said. He did me a kindness with the canvas, Claire said. I'd like to return it. She went on Wednesday. Bill Marsh showed her the structure with the careful expression of a man who knew something was wrong and had decided the best response was to show it straightforwardly without making excuses. Clara looked at the anchor points and the roof angle and figured out the problem in about 5 minutes. He'd used a different bale size for the second structure, slightly smaller, which threw off the geometry of the whole thing, and she told him how to fix it in plain, practical terms that didn't mention being wrong or right. He fixed it while she was there, and she helped with the heavy re-anchoring, and when it was done, he stood back and said, "Better," with the satisfaction of a man who had learned something he could use again. The smaller bales work fine if you adjust the crossbeam length, Claire said. I'll remember that, he said. 3 neighbors came to look at it over the next 2 weeks. Not because anyone organized it, they just came, the way people in sparse country come to look at practical innovations the way people in cities go to look at art. Something that solved a problem was worth seeing. Clara answered questions. She drew diagrams in the dirt with a stick when words weren't clear enough. She told two men that what they were planning was wrong and would waste their materials, and she told them plainly what to do instead. And they did it, and it worked. Caleb watched this happen from across the property lines of his ranch, and something settled in him that hadn't been settled before. The third letter from the county land office arrived in mid-February. This one was different in tone from the previous ones, less administrative, more substantive. It acknowledged receipt of Caleb's response and noted that the survey interpretation question had been referred for expert review, which was land office language for, "We are taking this seriously and not simply processing it out." Jim Dalby's contact at the assessor's office had written. His letter was attached to the county office correspondence as an exhibit. 3 paragraphs, precise and technical, explaining that the survey notation in question was a standard practice of the original surveyor in the district and consistently indicated a boundary running along the feature being cited, not west of it. Caleb read it 3 times. "That's it?" he said. "That's the beginning of it," Clara said. "Pratt's lawyer will file a response. The commissioner will review both sides. It could take months. But we're not losing." "We're not losing," she said. He set the letter down on the table. "I need to tell you something," he said. Clara waited. "The December letter, the one I didn't tell you about." He looked at the table. "I almost answered it wrong. It was right after the storm prep, and I was tired, and I almost wrote back and said I was open to discussing the eastern parcel." He looked up. "I almost gave him the opening he wanted." "But you didn't." "Because I thought about what you'd said about the water." He held her eyes. "I put the letter down and I thought about what you'd explained, about the water rights and what they meant for the valley, and I put it away instead of answering it." Clara was quiet. "I need you to know that," he said, "that it wasn't just the formal letters. It was, you told me what the thing was worth, before I knew to value it." "You knew the land was yours," Clara said. "You just needed the legal language for why. That's not—" He stopped himself. "Don't make it smaller than it was." She looked at him. "All right," she said. "I won't." Bob. February moved into March the way that month does in northern country. Not a change so much as a suggestion that change was possible, which was its own form of hope. The days lengthened by minutes that you felt rather than measured. The light came different in the afternoons, softer and more sideways. The cattle were still mostly in or near the barn, but they were moving more, eating better, and the heifer that Clara had been watching all winter had come through in better condition than Caleb had dared to predict in November. 26, Caleb said one morning, counting the herd. He'd been counting them with the quiet obsessiveness of a man who'd watched the number shrink and was learning to watch it hold. "We held 26 through the winter." 27 if the heifer delivers in April," Clara said. He looked at her. "You think she will?" "I think she's been carrying since October." She watched the heifer move across the pen. "She's been eating right. Her sides are filling out the way they should. I think early April." Caleb stared at the heifer for a long moment. "I had 11 head when you got here," he said. "I know." "How?" "The others were here," she said. "You just didn't have the resources to keep them healthy through the season. The windbreak, the feed management, moving the most vulnerable ones inside for the storm. It wasn't magic. It was margins, small margins that add up." He shook his head slowly, not in disagreement, in the private recalibration of a man measuring the distance between where he'd been and where he stood now. "Thomas wants to help with the spring fence work," he said. "He's old enough." "I know he is. He paused. "I haven't been letting him do enough. I've been keeping him back, protecting him from something he doesn't need protecting from." "He's been waiting for you to let him in," Clara said carefully. "I know." He rubbed the back of his neck. "I kept looking at him and seeing how much he looks like Ruth, and I kept needing him to be the child and not the... He's been trying to be something I needed, and I let him." "He's also just a boy who wants to do fence work with his father," Claire said. Caleb looked at her. Something in his face that was simpler than guilt and more useful. The straightforward recognition of a thing that could still be corrected. "Tell him tonight," she said. "Tell him you're going to teach him the south fence come March. He'll be up before dawn the next morning." He nodded. "What about Meg?" Meg is 4 and she will supervise from whatever surface she can climb on, Clara said. Which is all she requires. He laughed, a real one this time, shorter than it might eventually become, but real, with actual sound to it. Clara hadn't heard him laugh like that before. It was a good sound. She filed it away somewhere she wasn't going to examine too carefully. Dorothy Finch did the thing she'd been working up to in the second week of March, and she did it in her own way, which was by doing it first and informing Clara about it second. She had organized a work party. Not a social gathering, not a neighborly visit, a work party, the old kind, where people showed up with tools and time and worked a specific problem. The problem, as Dorothy had framed it to the 8 families she'd contacted, was the barn roof on Black Juniper Ranch, which had been losing shingles since the fall and which Caleb hadn't had the hands or the money to address. Left until summer, it would become a structural issue. Fixed now, before the spring rains came in earnest, it would hold for years. 12 people arrived on a Saturday morning. Bill Marsh with shingles he'd been milling from timber on his property. Jim Dalby with nails and a good hammer. Helen Marsh and 2 other women with food enough for the day. 3 men Clara didn't know well, who tied their horses at the rail and went straight to the barn to assess the situation with the professional efficiency of people who'd done this for neighbors before. Caleb came out of the house and stopped. He stood on the porch and looked at the assembled people and their equipment, and for a moment he didn't say anything. Dorothy appeared beside him. "Don't make a speech," she said. "We're here to work." "Dorothy," he said. You can't pay us," she said. "We know that. This isn't about paying." She looked at him squarely. "You went out on a rope in a blizzard for a man who didn't deserve it. You saved 3 cattle that weren't yours and didn't ask for anything back. You responded to that land office nonsense instead of just rolling over." She paused. "And you kept this ranch running when most people in this valley expected it to fold. People want to be here. Let them." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you, Dorothy," he said. She said, which was as close to "you're welcome" as Dorothy Finch usually got, and she went inside to organize the food table. Clara worked the barn roof alongside the 3 men she didn't know, and by mid-morning she'd learned their names: Pete Hauser, Frank Della, and a young man called Ira who was Della's son-in-law and was trying to make himself useful with the particular effort of someone who'd been told to show up and wasn't entirely sure what he was doing there. She put him on the nail supply and showed him the pattern once, and he was fine after that, systematic and quiet, and actually quite helpful. By afternoon, the roof was done. Not perfect. The original roof line had a sag in one rafter that would need addressing eventually, but solid and weather-tight in a way it hadn't been since before Ruth died. Caleb stood at the base of the barn and looked up at it in the late afternoon light. Bill Marsh came to stand beside him. "Ira did the northeast corner," he said. "Kid's not bad." "I'll tell him," Caleb said. "You don't have to tell him. He knows." Marsh looked at the roof. "The sag is in the 3rd rafter from the east wall." "I know it is." "I can help you with that in April, when the weather's better." Caleb looked at him. "Bill." "Don't," Marsh said. "I'm going to say it anyway." "Don't." "You've been a better neighbor than I deserved this year." Marsh was quiet for a moment. He looked at the roof. "My wife and your wife were friends," he said. "Whatever I've done for you this winter, Helen told me to do it. Half of it was her idea." He paused. "She liked Ruth. I liked Caleb. Now it's different, but the liking's the same." Caleb didn't say anything. "That woman of yours," Marsh said, nodding in the direction of Clara, who was helping Helen break down the food table. "She's the reason any of this happened. Dorothy organizing the work party, people coming. You know that, right?" "I know," Caleb said. "She built the windbreak that saved Cutter. She dealt with the land office business. She got you out of the house and to the gathering and made it possible for people to do things for you." He glanced sideways at Caleb. "She didn't do any of that to be noticed. She just did it." "That's how she is," Caleb said. "I know." Marsh pulled his coat straighter. "Don't be slow about it, is all I'm saying." "About what?" Marsh gave him a look that required no elaboration and walked away to get his horse. The evening after the work party, after everyone had gone and the children were in bed, Caleb found Clara sitting on the porch steps in her coat, looking at the last of the light in the western sky. He sat beside her. Not an unusual thing. They'd been in the same spaces together comfortably for months now, but different, because the work party had been different, and the conversation with Marsh had been different, and things that had been moving slowly were moving faster now. Tired, he said. A little, she said. Good tired. The roof looks right, he said. It is right. The rafter issue is structural, not cosmetic. Spring project. Marsh offered to help with it. I heard. He was quiet for a moment. The sky was doing the thing it sometimes did in winter, the colors coming in deeper as the light went, a purple-gray layered over a cold orange at the horizon, and above it the first stars beginning to be visible. Can I ask you something? He said. You're going to ask me whether I'm comfortable here, Clara said. Whether this is what I thought it would be when I showed up in November. He looked at her. I was going to ask whether you'd stay past spring. Past spring is the same question. Is it? You're asking if I'm going to leave. She looked at the horizon. I told you in January I wasn't going anywhere unless you asked me to. I remember. He was quiet. I'm asking something different now. She turned and looked at him. In the fading light, he was harder to read than usual, which mostly meant he was being more careful than usual, and she recognized the careful as the signal it had always been with him. The signal that something mattered enough to be afraid of. Then ask it, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at his hands, and then back at her. I want you to stay, he said. Not as a hand, not for room and board. I want... He stopped, steadied himself. I want you to stay because this is where you belong. Because this is your place as much as mine. Because the children... He stopped again, and this time the stop was longer, and she waited. Thomas told me 2 weeks ago, he said, that you were the person who made him feel like things were going to be all right. Not me. You. He looked at her. And my first feeling was, I was ashamed. Because I should have been that person and I wasn't, not for months. I let him carry things he shouldn't have carried. He paused. And my second feeling was grateful. That there was someone in this house who could be that for him when I couldn't. Clara was quiet. I'm not asking you to be Ruth, he said. I'm not asking you to be anything other than what you are. I'm asking if what you are wants to be here. The last light was going. The stars were brighter now, coming through one by one over the dark outline of the tree line. Yes, she said. It does. He let out a breath. He reached over and put his hand over hers where it rested on her knee, and she turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that on the cold porch while the night came in and the ranch settled into its evening sounds around them. The cattle shifting, the barn creaking in the light wind, a horse moving somewhere in the dark. There's still the land office business, she said after a while. I know. And the south fence. I know. And the heifer in April. Clara, he said. Yes. I'm aware of the things on the list. I'm just noting that it's a long list. It's always a long list on a ranch, he said. That's not a reason. No, she said. It's not. She held his hand in the cold and looked at the stars and thought about her father's lost homestead and the letter he hadn't known how to answer, and about Pearl and Billings and the long winters in other people's places, and about the gray horse she'd ridden here in November that had wanted no part of the cold, and about Thomas putting staples in his pocket so they wouldn't be lost. She thought about what it meant to be somewhere instead of passing through it. She thought it probably meant exactly this, sitting on a porch in the cold, holding the hand of a man with a long list, with the dark ranch all around you, and the list being the reason you stayed instead of the reason you left. Inside, one of the children made a sound in their sleep. Caleb's hand tightened slightly on hers, reflexive, the way a parent's attention moves toward a child even half asleep. Then the sound settled and the quiet came back. Come inside, he said. It's cold. I know it's cold, she said. I've known it was cold since November. He stood and held out his hand, and she took it and stood, and they went inside together to the warm kitchen and the banked stove, and the porch was empty behind them in the starlight, and the ranch was quiet, and none of the things on the list had gone anywhere. They were all still there, waiting for morning, the way necessary things do. The land commissioner's decision came on a Thursday in late March, in an envelope that was thicker than the others had been. Clara was in the barn when Caleb came to find her. She knew from the way he walked, not hurrying, but with a quality of purpose that was different from his usual morning movement, that something had arrived. She set down the brush she'd been using on the heifer's flank and straightened up and looked at him. He held the envelope out without saying anything. She opened it, read it through once, quickly, for the shape of it, then read it again slowly, for the meaning. The commissioner had ruled in Caleb's favor. The language was technical and thorough, citing the survey expert's testimony, the original surveyor's standard notation practice, and the specific wording of the boundary description. The eastern parcel of Black Juniper Ranch, including the creek and its east bank, was confirmed as falling within the deed as originally filed. Gerald Pratt's competing claim was dismissed as without sufficient foundation in the documentary record. The county land office was directed to close the dispute and record the confirmation. Clara folded the letter along its original creases. "It's over," she said. Caleb was leaning against the barn post with his arms crossed, watching her read. "For now," he said, "he could appeal." He could, but an appeal costs money, and he already lost the survey argument cleanly. His lawyer will tell him it's not worth it. She handed the letter back. He's going to let it go. Men like Pratt move on to easier targets when one gets too expensive. Caleb took the letter and looked at it. He looked at it for a long time without saying anything, and Clara waited, because she knew this moment was larger for him than just the legal outcome. It was the thing he'd nearly given up without knowing what he was giving. "My father homesteaded this land," he said. "He filed that deed in 1861. He built the first cabin here, the one that's the storage room now." He paused. "He died before I was old enough to know him well. My mother ran this place for 11 years before she passed." He folded the letter. "I was 22 when I took it over. I thought I understood what it was worth." He looked up. "I didn't. Not until someone almost took it." Clara looked at him. "You knew," she said. "That's why you didn't answer Pratt in the spring. Not because you forgot to. Because some part of you knew you couldn't give it away." He was quiet. "The knowing that kept you from signing anything," she said. "That was your father's knowing and your mother's. You carried it even when you didn't have words for it." She held his eyes. "I just helped you find the words." He didn't answer immediately. He put the letter in his coat pocket and pushed off from the barn post and came to where she was standing, and he looked at her in the direct way he'd been learning to manage since January, the way that didn't slide sideways. "I want to show you something," he said. He took her to the eastern fence line. They walked it together in the cold March morning, the ground still hard but with the first suggestions of give underfoot where the frost was beginning to lose its grip. The creek was audible before it was visible, a sound she'd grown to know over the winter, the low running talk of water that never quite froze because it moved too fast. They stood at the east bank. The creek was maybe 12 feet across, running clear over smooth stones, with ice still shelving out from both banks in the shaded spots where the sun hadn't reached yet. On the far bank, Pratt's property began. From here you could see the fence line that marked the difference. Caleb's posts on this side, Pratt's on the other, and the creek between them belonging to neither and both. Except that legally now, the east bank, this bank, where they were standing, was Caleb's, which meant the water source was Caleb's, which meant everything Jim Dalby's contact had told them about what this water was worth was confirmed and documented and protected. "My mother used to come here," Caleb said. "In summer, early morning, before it got hot, she'd sit right here on this bank." He looked at the water. "She told me once that water running was the sound of things continuing, that as long as you could hear it, things were still going." Clara stood beside him and listened to the creek. "I haven't been out here since Ruth died," he said. "I kept meaning to come, and I kept not coming." He looked at the water. "I don't know why I'm telling you that." "Because we're here now," Clara said. "That's reason enough." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "That's exactly it." They stood at the creek for a while without needing it to be more than it was. Two people in the cold listening to water run, with the hard winter behind them and the land confirmed and the list waiting patiently back at the ranch like it always did. It wasn't a beautiful moment in the way that stories sometimes make moments beautiful. It was cold, and her boots were damp, and somewhere behind them, a cow was complaining about something. But it was real, and real had started to feel like the better word for what she wanted. Gerald Pratt came to the ranch on a Friday in early April. He came alone, which was unusual for a man who liked an audience, and he tied his horse at the rail with the particular deliberateness of someone who has prepared himself for a conversation he didn't choose to have. Caleb was in the barn. Clara was on the porch, resetting a loose board on the rail, and she was the one who saw him first. She set down her hammer and waited. Pratt came up the path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He looked at Clara, and then he looked at the rail she'd been repairing, and then back at her. "Is Whitmore here?" he said. "He's in the barn," Clara said. "I can get him." "In a minute." He looked at the porch, the house, the general aspect of the property in early April. The windbreak still standing, the barn with its new roofline, the fence posts that had been replaced in fall and were sitting straight. "Place looks better than last year," he said. "It is better than last year," Clara said. He nodded once, accepting this without the editorial he might have added 6 months ago. He was a man recalibrating, she could see it, not converting exactly, but updating. Men like Pratt ran constant calculations, and the calculation had come back different enough that he'd driven out here. "I got the commissioner's decision," he said. "I know. My lawyer says it's solid," he said it flatly, "that the survey language is what it is. That's what the commissioner found." "Yeah." He looked at the creek direction, though you couldn't see the creek from here. "The water rights stand." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "Ed Cutter told me what happened in the blizzard," he said. "He told me in December and I didn't. I didn't come out here and say anything about it." You didn't have to," Clara said. "I know I didn't have to." He looked at her. "I'm saying I should have." He said it with the clipped brevity of a man who doesn't apologize often and wants to get through the words before he changes his mind. "Your windbreak. He found it in the white. He used it to navigate. Without that structure, he'd have been in the open another hour at least." "Your foreman is a tough man," Claire said. "He might have made it anyway." "Maybe," Pratt said. "Maybe not." He looked at her steadily. "I said things about you. In town. Before I knew you." "I remember." "I said the ranch was finished and anyone who hitched themselves to it was a fool." "I remember that too." He held her eyes. "I was wrong about the ranch," he said, "and I was wrong about you." Clara looked at him for a moment. He was not a changed man. She didn't think men like Pratt changed in the fundamental sense, the way the soil composition of a piece of land didn't change just because you cultivated the surface. But he was a man who could update his position when the evidence was overwhelming enough, and that was something. In her experience, it was more than a lot of people managed. "Get Caleb," she said. He blinked. "Go around to the barn and get Caleb," she said. "Whatever you came to say it to both of us." He looked at her for another moment, then he nodded and went around the side of the house toward the barn. She picked up her hammer and went back to the rail and listened to the sound of Pratt's boots on the frozen ground and let herself feel, quietly and without drama, that something was closing that had been open and cold for a long time. Kisi. The heifer delivered on the 9th of April. Clara had been watching for it for 2 weeks, checking the animal every morning and every evening with the attention of someone who'd seen this go wrong and knew the signals. When it started, she got Caleb from the house at 4 in the morning, and they worked together in the barn for 3 hours. And it was difficult and messy. And at one point, the calf was turned wrong, and Clara's hands were inside the animal making the correction, while Caleb held the heifer steady and talked to her in a low voice that Clara noted with a corner of her mind was the same voice he used with his children when they were frightened. The calf came out alive, wet and indignant, shaking its head, making the sound that newborn cattle make, not a moo exactly, more of a complaint about having been asked to exist in such an abrupt and cold manner. Caleb sat back on his heels in the hay and looked at it. 27, he said. I told you, April, Clara said. She was wiping her hands on a cloth and her back ached and her knees ached, and she probably had hay in her hair. She didn't especially care. You told me, April, he agreed. He looked up at her. There was something in his face that was very simple. Not the complicated, layered expression she'd grown used to reading in him, but something underneath all of that, something that had been there a long time waiting for the weight to lift enough to show. "Come here," he said. She sat beside him in the hay, both of them leaning against the stall boards, watching the calf figure out its legs. The heifer was turned around now, doing what mothers do, and the barn was warm with animal heat and the particular smell of new life that was not romantic but was deeply, essentially real. "I want to ask you something," Caleb said. "You've been saying that a lot lately," she said. "I keep having things to ask." "Then ask." He was quiet for a moment. In the stall across from them, the new calf took its first genuine step and then sat down immediately, surprised by the outcome. "Marry me," Caleb said. It was not a question, quite. It was not a declaration either. It was the particular thing it was. A man saying a true thing in the plainest language he had, without ornamentation, without strategy, without anything except the meaning itself. Clara looked at the calf sitting in the hay with its surprised expression. "You're asking me in a barn," she said, "at 4 a.m, with hay in your hair, and I don't want to tell you what's on your coat." "I know what's on my coat," he said. "I was there." "This is how you ask." "I'm not a man who waits for the right moment," he said. "I've been waiting for the right moment since January, and I've decided there isn't one. There's just the moment you're in." Clara looked at him. He was watching her with the directness that still cost him something, that she still respected him for managing. No sideways slide, just the question and the waiting. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath. The calf made another attempt at standing, and this time stayed up, wobbling but committed. "Good," Caleb said. "You keep saying that. It keeps being the right word." She leaned her head against his shoulder briefly, and he put his arm around her, and they sat in the hay in the cold barn at 4:30 in the morning and watched the newest thing on Black Juniper Ranch figure out how to be alive. They told the children at breakfast. Thomas had already been up when they came in from the barn, because Thomas was always up, sitting at the table with his school book, and a look that suggested he'd been up long enough to wonder what was happening. Caleb set the coffee on and then stood at the table and looked at his son and then at the doorway to Meg's room and said, "Tom, go get your sister." Thomas looked at him, then at Clara, then back at his father. He went and got Meg, who arrived carried, half asleep, listing sideways in Thomas's arms and making clear through her expression that the hour was unacceptable. Caleb sat at the table. Clara sat across from him. Thomas stood with Meg on his hip in the doorway. "I've asked Clara to marry me," Caleb said. She said yes. "I want you both to know." Thomas was very still. Meg said, "Kawa?" "Yes, sweetheart," Clara said. Meg considered this information for a moment and then said, "Okay," in the tone of someone who had just been told something she had already assumed and was mildly confused about why it required announcement. Thomas put Meg down. He stood in the doorway for a moment with the careful expression of a boy processing something he'd hoped for and was now afraid to believe. "Is this for real?" he said. "Yes," Caleb said. "She's staying?" "She's staying," Clara said. Thomas looked at her. He looked at his father. He took 2 steps into the kitchen and sat down in his chair and picked up his pencil and looked at his school book. His jaw was working in the way it did when he was managing something larger than he wanted to show. "Good," he said into the school book. The word came out slightly rough. "That's good." Meg climbed into Clara's lap and grabbed her braid and began to examine it with the focused interest of a scientist studying a new specimen. Thomas did not look up from his school book for another 2 minutes. When he did, his face was more composed, but his eyes were bright in a way that he would have denied if anyone mentioned it. "Can I still go on the south fence with you?" he said to Caleb. "That was never conditional," Caleb said. Thomas nodded. He went back to his school book. Clara held Meg on her lap and looked at Caleb across the table, and he looked back at her, and the morning light was coming through the east window the way it did in April, longer and warmer than anything November had offered, falling across the table between them like something that had finally arrived. They married in May, on a Saturday, in the front yard of Black Juniper Ranch with 17 people present. Dorothy organized the food without being asked and would not hear any argument about it. Bill Marsh built a simple arbor from timber he had on hand and placed it near the fence line where the yard looked out over the east pasture, and Helen decorated it with branches and early wildflowers that were more stubborn than pretty, which was the appropriate aesthetic for Black Juniper Ranch. Jim Dalby stood up with Caleb. Thomas stood beside his father with the gravity of a boy who understood the weight of what was happening and was holding himself straight for it. Meg stood beside Clara in a dress that Dorothy had sewn, a small, serious figure in blue wool, clutching a bunch of the stubborn wildflowers with both hands. The justice of the peace from the county seat drove out, a thin man named Hooper, who had performed this service dozens of times and had the unhurried ease of someone who'd learned that wedding ceremonies were best kept simple and that the people in them generally knew what they were doing. Clara wore the best of what she had, a gray dress that she'd mended twice but that fit well and had a good collar, and she stood in the morning sunlight in the yard of a ranch that had been failing when she arrived, and looked at the man she was going to marry, who was looking at her with the direct, undeflected gaze that still felt like a gift every time he managed it. She had not imagined this in November. She hadn't been imagining anything in November except the cold and the work and the reason she'd stopped at the door of a struggling ranch, because something in her couldn't walk past what needed doing. She had not been looking for a place to belong. She'd stopped believing that was something that got found. You moved through places, you made yourself useful, you left when the usefulness was over. That was how it went. That was what she'd learned from her father's lost homestead and her brothers going separate ways and the long string of winters in other people's houses. She'd been wrong about that. Or not wrong exactly. She'd been right about everything she knew up to that point. She just hadn't known yet that belonging wasn't something you found. It was something that happened when you stayed long enough to build it. Hooper said the words. Caleb said his plainly, without embellishment, looking at her the whole time. She said hers the same way. Thomas held still with great effort. Meg dropped 3 of the wildflowers and picked them back up and attempted to eat one before Dorothy intercepted it with the reflexes of a woman who had been managing small children in social situations for 30 years. When Hooper said they were done, Caleb took Clara's face in both his hands and he kissed her in front of 17 people with the same plain honesty with which he did everything. And someone, it sounded like Helen, made a sound that was approximately a sob, and Dorothy said something sharp to someone nearby, and Jim Dalby said, "About time," in a tone that was audible to everyone. Thomas exhaled. It was the exhalation of a boy who had been holding something in for a very long time and had finally been given permission to put it down. Chet. That evening, after the guests were gone and Meg was asleep, and Thomas had finally succumbed to the day and gone to bed, Caleb and Clara sat on the porch. Not the cold, dark porch of winter, the April porch, with the temperature genuinely mild for the first time in months, the air carrying the smell of thaw and the beginning of things. "I need to tell you something," Caleb said. Clara looked at him. "I found something in the storage room last week," he said. "When I was moving the last of the winter tools, Ruth had a box in there, her planning box, she called it. She used to write things down, plans for the garden, for the house, ideas she had." He looked at his hands. "I almost didn't open it, and then I did." Clara waited. "She had a list," he said, "things she wanted to do with the ranch in the next 5 years. Expand the kitchen garden, repair the barn roof." He paused. "Build a windbreak on the northwest side of the cattle pen." Clara was very still. "She had it on the list," he said. "She'd drawn a rough diagram. She was going to do it the following winter." He looked up. "She didn't get to." Clara thought about Ruth's cellar organization system, which had been good, about the bread method with the wool blanket, which had worked until the stove situation changed, about the things a careful woman had planned for a place she loved. "She was smart," Clara said. "She was," Caleb said, "and she would have done all of it." He held her eyes. "I need you to know that the things you did, she had already thought of some of them. I don't want you to think that what you brought here replaced something that wasn't here. It completed something." Clara held that word, completed. "I don't feel like a replacement," she said honestly. "I feel like I came after. That's different." "Yes," he said. That's the word. They sat with that for a while. The evening dark was gentle in a way winter dark had never been, with the warmth still in the air from the afternoon sun and the sounds of the ranch settling into its night rhythms. The cattle quiet, the creek audible from the east if you listened for it, the barn boards contracting in the cooling air. She would have liked you, Caleb said. Clara wasn't sure what to do with that. She thought about it honestly. I think we might have disagreed about some things, she said carefully. He looked at her. She was organized in a particular direction, Clara said. I'm organized in a different direction. That doesn't always go smooth. Caleb almost smiled. She had opinions. I can tell. Strong opinions. I noticed. She would have argued with you about the windbreak, he said. She would have said it was unnecessary. She was planning to build one, Clara said. She would have said hers was a different kind. He was actually smiling now, a real one, with something bittersweet in it that was honest in a way a clean smile wouldn't have been. And then she would have respected that yours worked, and she would have modified her plan. That sounds like a reasonable woman, Clara said. She was, he said. She was the most reasonable, unreasonable person I've ever known. The smile faded slowly, not into sadness exactly, but into something more settled. I miss her. I know you do, Clara said. You should. He looked at her. Missing her and being here with me aren't in competition, she said. I know that. You know that. The children know that. He reached over and took her hand the way he'd learned to, not dramatically, just matter-of-factly, like it was the obvious thing. You said something to Thomas once, he said. He told me. About loving me and missing Ruth being the same feeling, all tangled up. I remember. He's been thinking about it, Caleb said. I can tell. He gets that look he gets when he's working something out. He paused. I've been thinking about it too. And? I think you were right, he said. I think they were the same feeling for a long time. And I think somewhere this winter they stopped being the same feeling. He looked at their joined hands. Missing her is its own thing now. Being here with you is its own thing. They're both real, and they're not fighting each other anymore. Clara held his hand and looked at the evening, and she thought that this was what healing actually looked like. Not the absence of grief, but the grief finding its proper size, its proper place, instead of taking up all the available space in a man until there was no room for anything else. She had not come here to heal anyone. She had come here because she couldn't walk past what needed doing. But sometimes those were the same action, and you only understood that in retrospect. Summer came to the valley by degrees, the way it always does in northern country. A few warm days, then a cold snap to remind you of your optimism, then the real warmth arriving and staying. The fields greened up faster than anyone expected after the hard winter, as if the land had been conserving something that it now released all at once. The cattle went out to summer pasture with 27 head. The calf from April, Thomas had named her April, because Thomas was 8 and also practical, was growing fast, still slightly surprised-looking, as if the world continued to be more than she had signed up for. Thomas worked the south fence with his father through May. Clara watched them from across the property sometimes, the man and the boy moving along the fence line, and she could see Caleb explaining things, the way you set a post, the way you read a wire for weakness, the particular things you were looking for when you were checking work that had to hold through a winter. Thomas listened with the whole-body attention he brought to everything, and occasionally she could see him asking questions, and Caleb answering them without the shortened patience of a man who wanted to be done. He was teaching his son, not because someone had suggested it, but because he'd looked up one day and seen who was there beside him, and decided to stop moving through his children and start being with them instead. That was not Clara's doing. She wanted to be clear about that, in her own mind. She had said some things, and the things had been heard, but the decision was his. The showing up was his. You could not do that for a person. You could only make it possible for them to see the doorway. Walking through it was theirs. Meg spent the summer attached to Clara with the particular devotion of a 4-year-old who has decided someone belongs to her, which meant she was underfoot during kitchen work and barn work, and any other work that occurred within her radius of attention. She had developed a running commentary on ranch life that had no off switch. She also had Ruth's eyes, which Clara had not known until Dorothy told her, and which Dorothy said sometimes in a way that was purely sad, and sometimes in a way that was something more complicated, and ultimately something like grateful. Passam. In July, Gerald Pratt filed no appeal. Jim Dalby brought the word, he'd heard from his contact at the county office, that the deadline had passed without action. He came by on a Thursday evening and told Caleb on the porch, and Caleb stood there and nodded, and that was essentially all there was to it. He's moved on, Dalby said. To someone else, Caleb said. Probably, but not to you. Caleb looked at the east pasture where the creek was audible in the summer quiet. The water's going to matter more in 20 years than it does now, he said. Weather's changing. People can feel it even if they can't name it. Water sources that run year-round are going to be... I know, Dalby said. That's why he wanted it. I know why he wanted it. Caleb looked at him. I'm saying my children are going to understand why it matters. I'm going to make sure of that. Dalby nodded. He picked up his hat. You turned out all right, Caleb, he said, in the tone of a man closing a long account. I had help, Caleb said. Dalby looked at the house, where the lamp was on in the kitchen window, and the sound of Clara and Dorothy arguing cheerfully about the appropriate way to put up summer preserves was faintly audible. You did, he said. He put his hat on and went to his horse. In the evenings that summer, when the day's work was done and the children were in bed, Caleb and Clara would sit on the porch in the warm dark, and sometimes they talked and sometimes they didn't, and both were good. She thought, on those evenings, about what it had taken to get here. Not just the winter's work, the windbreak, and the letters, and the blizzard, and the rope, but the other kind of work, the kind that doesn't have a name exactly. The work of staying when it would have been easier to move on. The work of saying the true thing in the moment when a careful thing would have been safer. The work of holding someone's damaged hands in the cold without making it into more than what it needed to be. She had been a person who moved through places, useful and temporary. She had believed that was simply her nature, but she understood now that it had been a choice she'd made so long ago and so quietly that it had stopped feeling like a choice. After her father's homestead, after her brothers left, after one winter too many in a place that wasn't hers, the choice had been to stay light, to stay ready, to never let a place be more than temporary, because temporary things couldn't be taken. She had been protecting herself from her father's loss by making sure she had nothing of the same kind to lose. It was a reasonable response to a real wound. Most self-protection is. It keeps you safe from the specific harm you're afraid of while costing you, slowly and quietly, the things that made safety worth wanting. She didn't think she'd wasted the years before Black Juniper Ranch. She'd learned things in those years that she'd needed. The work knowledge, yes, but also the knowledge of what it cost to be always passing through, always useful and temporary. She'd needed to know what the alternative felt like before she could recognize it. This is what she'd found. Belonging was not a feeling that arrived. It was a practice. It was made of small daily actions that accumulated, over time, into something that could hold weight. It was made of fixing a leaking roof before you were asked, and sitting with the child's arithmetic in the lamplight and going out on a rope in zero visibility because someone needed it. It was made of not leaving when things were hard and not pretending things were easy when they weren't. It was made, specifically, of the courage to stay when you had the option to go. She had always had the option to go. That was the thing people sometimes forgot. You chose your home the same way you chose your people. Not by waiting for the right circumstances, but by deciding that these circumstances, this land, these people, were worth the work of staying. Thomas found her one evening in late August, sitting at the kitchen table with the account books. He was 9 now, taller by a visible inch than he'd been at winter's end, and he had the look of a boy who had decided to ask something and had thought about the asking for a while. He sat down across from her. "Clara," he said. "Yes." "Do you think Ma knows about you?" She set her pen down. "I think about her sometimes," Thomas said. "Like, whether she knows, what happened this year, whether she's..." He stopped. "I don't know how any of that works." "Neither do I," Clara said honestly. "But if she did," he said, "if she could see, do you think she'd be okay with it? With you?" Clara thought about the cellar and the bread method and the windbreak on the list in the planning box. She thought about Dorothy saying Ruth was the most careful mother she'd known. She thought about a woman who had planned for the future of this ranch and had not gotten to see it. "I think," she said carefully, "that your mother loved this place and she loved your father and she loved you and your sister, and I think any person who loves something that much wants it to be taken care of after they're gone." She held Thomas's eyes. "I think she'd be more interested in whether you and Meg were well and whether your father was living his life again than in the particulars of who was doing the cooking." Thomas thought about this. "She'd want to know if you were good at it," he said. "The cooking?" "I'm decent," Claire said. "Not as good as Dorothy. Better than your father." "That's a low bar," Thomas said. "It really is." He almost smiled. It was Caleb's almost smile, the same shape, the same quality of almost. It would probably grow into the real thing the same way too. "I think she'd like you," he said. "I think she'd argue with you about stuff. But she'd like you." "I'll take that," Clara said. He nodded, satisfied, and went to bed. Autumn came back around, the way it always did, the light changing first, then the temperature, then the first hard frost on the ground in the morning, and the cattle starting to move differently, reading something in the air. The windbreak was already up and solid from last year's structure, reinforced in the spring with the permanent lumber Caleb and Bill Marsh had put in when the ground was workable. The cellar was full. The firewood was stacked and covered and properly sorted. Clara stood in the yard on a morning in early October and looked at the ranch around her, the fence lines holding, the barn roof sound, 27 cattle in the pasture with 2 more expected in spring, a root cellar that would carry them through to March without close management, a guide rope she'd left in place because even good winters had bad nights. It looked like a different ranch than the one she'd ridden to in November of the previous year. It looked like a place that had decided to survive. Caleb came out of the barn and crossed the yard toward her, unhurried, wiping his hands on his work cloth, and he stopped beside her and followed her gaze across the property. "Thinking?" he said. "Accounting," she said. "In my head." "Good accounting or bad accounting?" "Good," she said. "Very good, actually." He stood beside her and looked at the ranch. A year ago, he'd stood in approximately this spot and looked at the same land and seen something failing. She wondered if he saw it differently now. Not better land, the land was what it was, but a different arrangement of what was possible, what you could do with it if you weren't alone. "Tom asked me last night if he can take on the North Pasture check this winter," Caleb said. "Morning rounds. His responsibility." "What did you say?" "I said yes." A pause. "With conditions." "What conditions?" "That he checks in before he goes and after he gets back, and that if the weather's bad, he waits for me." "Those are good conditions." "He negotiated me down from 4 conditions to 2, Caleb said. "He said the other 2 were redundant." Clara looked at him. "Was he right?" "Mostly," Caleb said. She thought about Thomas at 8, standing with his hand on his sister's shoulder, with the look of a child who'd been the most reliable person in the room for too long. Thomas at 9, negotiating conditions with his father. The distance between those 2 versions of the boy was not large in time, but it was significant in kind. That was what safety did, when it arrived consistently enough to be trusted. It let children be the size they were supposed to be, instead of the size the situation had required. "He's going to be something," she said. "He already is," Caleb said, which were the words she'd said to him about Thomas in the barn the night of the blizzard, and he said them back now not as echo, but as a rival, as a man who had finally seen what had been there all along. Meg appeared in the doorway of the house, still in her nightclothes, holding a piece of bread in each hand in the manner of someone who had prepared for a long expedition, and called out something completely incomprehensible but obviously urgent. "That's our cue," Caleb said. "It always is," Clara said. They walked back to the house together, and Meg held out a piece of bread to each of them, with the generosity of a child who has plenty and knows it, and Clara took hers and held it and thought about everything it had taken to get to a morning in October where a 4-year-old offered you bread in a doorway, and it felt like the exact right place to be. She had not arrived here looking for home. She had arrived looking for work in the cold, which was all she'd allowed herself to look for in a long time. But she had stayed, and staying had made her indispensable, and being indispensable had made her necessary, and being necessary had made her, over the slow course of a hard winter and an uncertain spring and a summer that had finally been allowed to be easy, irreplaceable. Not because no one else could have done the work. Someone else might have. But because she had been the one who came and who stayed and who learned the shape of this specific place and these specific people, and who let them, in return, learn hers. That was what home was. Not a place that was given to you, a place you made true by choosing it, again and again, in the small daily ways that didn't look like choosing, but were. She had chosen Black Juniper Ranch. And Black Juniper Ranch, in its own way, through the children and the man and the creek and the early October light falling across the yard, had chosen her back. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything.